What if the rivers you learned about in school, the Nile, the Amazon, the Ganges, are not the rivers that mattered most? What if beneath the forests and mountains, hidden under centuries of soil and silence, there flows another geography entirely? A ghost network of waterways that once carried not just water, but people, knowledge, civilizations that moved through a world we can no longer see. What if the maps we trust are showing us only half the earth, only the surface, while beneath lies the true story of how humanity spread, connected, and remembered? There is a technology that can see through time. It is called LiDAR, light detection and ranging, and it strips away the forests, the undergrowth, the accumulated debris of millennia to reveal what lies beneath. And what it reveals, in places scattered across continents, are lines, channels, depressions in the earth that follow patterns too consistent to be natural, too purposeful to be coincidence. These are the beds of ancient rivers, rivers that no longer flow, rivers that have been dry for so long that even their names have been forgotten. But they were there. They carried water. And along their banks, something remarkable happened. People built, people settled, people traveled. And when the rivers died, the people vanished too, leaving only these faint traces, these whispers in the earth, waiting for us to notice, to measure, to understand. If you are drawn to the kind of history that hides beneath what we think we know, to the mysteries that technology is only now beginning to reveal, gently tap the like button. And if you want to journey with us into the hidden geographies of the past, consider subscribing. You are part of a quiet community that finds wonder in what has been forgotten. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and whether you live near a river, and whether you have ever wondered what flowed there before, what paths the water carved before it changed course or disappeared entirely. Because this is not just about ancient rivers. This is about the invisible infrastructure of the past, the networks that connected our ancestors in ways we are only now beginning to glimpse. The first clue appeared not in a library, but in a computer. Researchers running LiDAR scans over the Amazon rainforest were looking for lost cities, for pyramids hidden beneath the canopy. And they found them, but they found something else too. Between the settlements, connecting them, running for hundreds of miles through what is now dense jungle, were channels, raised causeways, geometric depressions that could only be one thing: engineered waterways. Rivers that had been modified, directed, controlled. Rivers that had been made to serve human purposes. And when the researchers traced these channels, when they followed them through the data, they realized these were not isolated systems. They were networks, vast, interconnected networks of water transport that linked settlements separated by distances that should have been impassable through jungle. But they were not impassable. Not if you traveled by water. Not if you knew the rivers. And this pattern is not unique to the Amazon. In Cambodia, LiDAR revealed the true extent of Angkor, showing that the temples we knew were only the ceremonial centers of a much larger city. A city organized around water management systems of staggering sophistication. Canals, reservoirs, channels that distributed water across hundreds of square miles, that turned a seasonal floodplain into a year-round transportation and agricultural network. In Sri Lanka, beneath the forests, ancient reservoir systems covering thousands of acres, connected by channels, creating a water network that rivaled anything built until the modern era. In the American Southwest, evidence of canals and irrigation systems that predate any civilization we officially recognize in that region. And in Central America, in the jungles of Guatemala and Belize, vast networks of causeways and channels connecting Maya cities, allowing them to move goods and people through terrain that should have been impossible to traverse. But here is what is unsettling. These networks do not match the rivers we see today. They follow waterways that no longer exist. They run through valleys where no water flows. They connect basins that are now dry. It is as if the people who built them were living in a different landscape, moving through a different geography, following rivers that have since vanished from the earth. And the question becomes, where did the rivers go? And if the rivers are gone, what happened to the people who depended on them? Imagine standing on a ridge overlooking a valley. Below you, a river winds through the landscape, its waters dark and swift. Along its banks, you see clearings, structures, the smoke of fires. You see boats moving on the water, carrying goods, people, stories from one settlement to another. The river is the highway, the communication system, the lifeline. Everything is organized around it. The settlements are placed at strategic points, where tributaries meet, where the current slows, where the banks are firm enough to build. The entire civilization is shaped by the river, oriented toward it, dependent on it. And then, gradually or suddenly, the river begins to change. Perhaps the climate shifts. Perhaps the rainfall patterns alter. Perhaps something upstream, a landslide, an earthquake, a change in the watershed, diverts the flow, and the river diminishes. It becomes a stream, a trickle, a dry bed, and the people who lived along it face a choice: adapt or move. Some stay, trying to draw water from wells, from the remaining pools. But without the river, without the transportation network, without the connection to other settlements, they are isolated. And slowly, over years or generations, they disperse. They abandon the settlements. They follow the water to wherever it has gone. And the structures they built, the pathways they carved, the systems they engineered, they remain silent, slowly being buried under soil and vegetation, forgotten. This has happened many times in human history. We know of civilizations that collapsed when their water sources failed. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley, which may have declined when the rivers shifted course. The Akkadian Empire, which fell during a centuries-long drought. The Maya, whose cities were abandoned during extended dry periods. But what if this pattern goes back farther? What if there were earlier networks, earlier civilizations, organized around rivers that have been gone so long we have no historical memory of them? What if the LiDAR is revealing not just forgotten cities, but forgotten geographies, landscapes that existed in times we do not account for, in periods we classify as prehistory, when we assume humans were scattered hunter-gatherers, not organized into networks capable of engineering waterways and managing river systems on continental scales? And there is evidence that suggests this. Evidence that whispers of a time when the earth was wetter, when rivers flowed where now there are only deserts and dry valleys, when lakes filled basins that have been empty for millennia. The Sahara, now the largest hot desert on the planet, was once green. Between approximately 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, during what geologists call the African humid period, the Sahara was a landscape of rivers and lakes, grasslands and forests. Rock art found in the central Sahara depicts hippopotamuses, crocodiles, people fishing from boats. The ancient Egyptians called the desert the Red Land, but they remembered a time when it was different, when it was habitable, when people lived there. And in the deep desert, in places now utterly dry, satellite imaging and ground surveys have found the traces of ancient river systems, massive channels that once carried water from the interior of Africa to the Mediterranean, rivers that would have been larger than the Nile, that would have created corridors of life through what is now wasteland. And these lost rivers of the Sahara are not isolated anomalies. Across the planet, geologists and archaeologists are finding evidence of vanished waterways, of river systems that existed during periods when the climate was different, when the distribution of water across the continents followed patterns unlike anything we see today. In Australia, dry channels crisscross the interior, remnants of rivers that flowed during the Pleistocene, creating networks that would have allowed movement across a continent that is now largely impassable. In India, there are references in ancient texts to a great river called the Sarasvati, which is said to have been as mighty as the Ganges, but which no longer exists. For years, scholars dismissed this as mythology. But satellite imaging has revealed the traces of a massive river system that once flowed through northwestern India, a river that dried up around 4,000 years ago, coinciding with the decline of the Harappan civilization. The river was real, and the settlements along its banks were real. And when the river died, the civilization that depended on it could not survive. So the question is not whether ancient river systems existed. The question is, who used them? Who knew them? Who organized their lives and their societies around waterways that we can no longer see? Because if these rivers were there, supporting ecosystems, creating fertile valleys, providing transportation routes, then people would have used them. People always go to the water. Water is life. Water is connection. Water is the first highway, the natural route that requires no construction, only knowledge. And if people were using these rivers, if they were building settlements along them, if they were creating networks of communication and trade, then we are looking at civilizations that existed in geographies that no longer exist, at populations that move through landscapes we cannot visit, that we can only glimpse through the faint traces they left behind. And this is where the unsettling part begins. Because the traces are not crude. They are not the random camps of nomadic hunter-gatherers. They are sophisticated. They are engineered. The LiDAR scans show not just natural riverbeds, but modified channels. They show causeways, raised platforms that would have kept pathways dry during floods. They show evidence of water control structures, dams or weirs that would have regulated flow, that would have allowed communities to manage their water supply, to store it during wet seasons and release it during dry. These are not the works of people experimenting with basic survival. These are the works of people who understood hydrology, who could plan on scales that encompassed entire watersheds, who could coordinate labor across multiple settlements to build infrastructure that benefited the collective. This is civilization, not in the sense of cities and writing and kings necessarily, but in the sense of organized, cooperative, forward-thinking human societies that shaped their environment to suit their needs. But here is the paradox. According to our conventional timeline, these river systems existed during periods when we believe humans were just beginning to settle down, just beginning to experiment with agriculture, just beginning to form permanent communities. The African humid period, when the Sahara was green and its rivers flowed, ended around 5,000 years ago. The ancient rivers of India dried up around the same time. The river networks of the Amazon that LiDAR is revealing were active during periods that predate the civilizations we know about. And yet, the infrastructure we are finding suggests a level of organization, a level of knowledge, a level of social complexity that does not fit with our assumptions about what humans were capable of during those periods. It is as if we are discovering evidence of a prologue to history, a chapter that came before the chapters we have been reading, a time when people were doing things we did not think they were doing, in places we did not think they were living, using systems we did not think they had developed. Consider what it takes to manage a river system. You need to understand the watershed, the entire area from which the river draws its water. You need to understand seasonal patterns, rainfall, snowmelt, flooding cycles. You need to be able to predict when the water will be high and when it will be low. You need to know where to place settlements so they are near the water but safe from floods. You need to know how to dig channels, how to build embankments, how to create reservoirs. You need to coordinate with other communities upstream and downstream, because what one community does affects everyone else. This is not simple. This is complex social organization. This is governance. This is engineering. And the evidence suggests that people were doing this, successfully, for extended periods, in places and times that our history books barely acknowledge. And they left markers. Not just the physical traces of the infrastructure, but something else. Stories, myths, references in the oral traditions of cultures that survived, that carried forward fragments of memory from times before. And when you start looking at these myths, when you start listening to what they say about water, about rivers, about the movements of ancestors, you find something remarkable. You find that many cultures, across many continents, have stories about rivers that once were. Stories about how the ancestors followed water through lands that are now dry. Stories about great rivers that disappeared, that sank into the earth or were swallowed by the gods. Stories about a time when the world was different, when water flowed in places where it no longer flows, when paths existed that no longer exist. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, there are dreaming stories that describe journeys across the interior, journeys that follow watercourses, that mark the locations of springs and rivers. And many of these stories describe waterways that do not exist today, that would not make sense in the current landscape. But when archaeologists map the ancient river systems revealed by satellite imaging, they find that the dreaming tracks align with the vanished rivers. The stories are not fantasy. They are memory. They are the preserved knowledge of a time when the landscape was different, when the rivers flowed, when the ancestors walked those paths and taught their children to remember them, to keep them in the songs and stories, so that even when the rivers were gone, the knowledge of them would remain. In India, the ancient texts, the Vedas, make repeated references to the Sarasvati River, describing it as a mighty waterway, a sacred river, a river along which great cities stood. For centuries, scholars assumed this was metaphorical, a spiritual river, not a physical one. But the satellite data proves them wrong. The river was real, and the cities along its banks were real. And when the river dried up, the cities were abandoned, but the memory of the river remained, preserved in the texts, in the rituals, in the songs. The river became sacred not because it was imagined, but because it was remembered, because it was mourned, because the people who had lived along it carried the loss of it forward into their culture, keeping it alive in words long after the water was gone. In the Amazon, indigenous groups have oral traditions that speak of ancestors who lived in great numbers, who built large settlements, who moved through the forest along paths of water. For centuries, outsiders dismissed these stories, assuming the Amazon had always been a sparsely populated wilderness. But the LiDAR is proving the stories true. The settlements existed, the causeways existed, the water networks existed, and the people who lived there were not isolated tribes barely surviving in the jungle. They were sophisticated societies managing complex systems, shaping the landscape, thriving. And when something changed, when the climate shifted, when the rivers altered course, they adapted or moved. But the memory remained. The stories remained, passed down through generations, waiting for a time when the technology would exist to reveal what the stories had been saying all along. This happened. This was real. This was us. There is a phrase that appears in multiple mythologies, across cultures that supposedly had no contact: the silver rivers. In Norse mythology, rivers that flow from the world tree. In Hindu tradition, the celestial river Ganga descending from the heavens. In Chinese mythology, the Silver River, the Milky Way, but also a reference to earthly waterways that shimmer with sacred significance. In South American indigenous traditions, rivers that shine, that carry the ancestors, that mark the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of spirits. The imagery is consistent. Rivers that are more than water, rivers that are pathways, rivers that connect not just places but times, that carry not just boats but souls, that are remembered not just for what they provided but for what they represented. What if these references are not purely metaphorical? What if they are distorted memories of actual rivers? Rivers that were so important, so central to the lives of the people who depended on them, that they became sacred, mythologized, transformed into cosmic symbols. Rivers that, when they vanished, left such a profound absence that the memory of them was elevated into the realm of the divine, preserved in the stories, in the rituals, in the names that cultures carried forward even when the physical rivers were gone. This is not a new idea. Scholars of mythology have long recognized that many myths contain kernels of historical truth, events and landscapes transformed through repeated telling into supernatural narratives. The flood myths found across the world likely derive from actual flooding events, from the rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, from regional disasters caused by tsunamis or dam collapses or storm surges. The memory of the event persists, but it is filtered through generations of oral tradition until it becomes something larger, something symbolic, something that speaks to existential truths rather than mere historical facts. But what if the same is true for the rivers? What if the silver rivers of mythology are the ghosts of actual waterways? Rivers that were so vital, so life-giving, that they were seen as divine, as gifts from the gods, as sacred arteries connecting the people to the cosmos. And what if, when these rivers dried up or changed course, the trauma of that loss was so profound that it shaped the mythology of the cultures that survived, embedding in their stories a longing for a time when the water flowed, when the paths were open, when the connections were intact? The rivers become silver not because they were literally made of silver, but because memory polishes them, because distance and loss transform them into ideals, into symbols of a better time, a time when the world was more generous, when the ancestors walked paths that are no longer available to us. Imagine you are part of a community that has lived along a river for generations. Your grandparents' grandparents were born on its banks. Your entire culture is organized around its rhythms. You know when it will flood and when it will recede. You know where the fish gather and where the crocodiles nest. You know which plants grow along its edges and which berries ripen in which season. You travel up and down the river to trade with other communities, to visit relatives, to attend ceremonies. The river is not just a feature of your landscape. It is your landscape. It is the defining fact of your existence. And then, over years or decades, the river begins to fail. The floods are less predictable. The dry seasons last longer. The water level drops. The fish become scarce. The plants wither. And eventually, the river is no longer reliable. It becomes a stream, a series of pools, a dry channel. And your community faces a crisis. You cannot stay. You must follow the water. And so you leave, carrying with you whatever you can, abandoning the structures you built, the fields you cultivated, the graves of your ancestors. And as you walk away, as you look back at the riverbed that is now just sand and stone, you make a promise. You promise to remember. You promise to tell your children about the river, about how it sustained you, about how it connected you to the world. And your children tell their children. And the story is passed down. And over time, over centuries, the river is no longer just a river. It becomes the river. It becomes sacred. It becomes silver. It becomes the path the ancestors walked, the connection to the divine, the symbol of what was lost and what might be found again. This is how memory works. This is how history becomes myth. Not because people are inventing stories, but because they are preserving truths that no longer fit the landscape, truths that require explanation, context, interpretation. And when the context is lost, when the landscape changes so much that the original truth is no longer visible, the story remains but it transforms. It becomes larger, more archetypal, more symbolic. And we, looking back from our perspective, from our maps that show only the rivers that flow today, we see the stories and we think mythology, fantasy, imagination. But what if we are wrong? What if the stories are trying to tell us something real, something about a geography that no longer exists, about networks that no longer function, about a time when the human world was organized differently because the physical world was different? And the LiDAR is giving us the tools to test this hypothesis. For the first time in human history, we can see through the forests and the soil and the accumulated debris of millennia to reveal the landscapes of the past. We can map the ancient rivers. We can trace the networks. We can see where the settlements were placed and how they were connected. And when we do this, when we overlay the physical evidence with the mythological evidence, when we compare the river systems revealed by technology with the river references preserved in stories, we find correlations. We find that the myths are describing real places, real routes, real systems. The silver rivers are not fantasies. They are memories. And the people who preserved these memories, who kept them alive in songs and stories and rituals, they were doing something profoundly important. They were maintaining a connection to a past that would otherwise have been completely lost. They were keeping alive the knowledge of how their ancestors lived, where they traveled, what paths they followed. And that knowledge, encoded in myth, is now being decoded by science. Consider the implications. If the myths are preserving real geographical information, if the stories about ancestral migrations and sacred rivers are based on actual routes and actual waterways, then we need to take the myths more seriously. We need to listen to them not as entertaining fables but as potential data sources, as archives of information about times and places that left no written records. The oral traditions of indigenous cultures, the epic poems of ancient civilizations, the foundation myths of the world's religions, all of these may contain, embedded within their narrative structures, real information about the past, about events and landscapes and migrations that occurred before writing was invented, before cities were built, before the historical record begins. And if we can learn to read these stories correctly, if we can learn to separate the symbolic from the historical, the archetypal from the actual, we might be able to reconstruct aspects of human history that we thought were lost forever. But this requires a shift in perspective. It requires acknowledging that the people of the past were not primitive, not ignorant, not incapable of preserving accurate information across generations. It requires recognizing that oral tradition, when maintained carefully, when embedded in ritual and ceremony, when taught systematically from elder to child, can be remarkably stable, can preserve information for thousands of years with a fidelity that rivals written records. And it requires humility. It requires admitting that we do not know everything, that our maps are incomplete, that our histories are partial, that there are vast stretches of the human past that remain mysterious, that can only be accessed through the combination of multiple lines of evidence. Archaeological, geological, mythological, technological. The rivers that no longer flow. The settlements that are now buried. The stories that are still told. Together, they paint a picture of a human past that is far more complex, far more interconnected, far more sophisticated than we have allowed ourselves to imagine. Now let us scale up. Let us consider what it means if these were not isolated river networks, not independent systems developed by separate cultures, but parts of a larger whole. What if the evidence we are finding in the Amazon, in the Sahara, in India, in Australia, in Southeast Asia, is not evidence of parallel development but evidence of connection? What if there was, during certain periods when the climate was different and the rivers flowed in patterns unlike today, a network, an actual functioning network of water routes that allowed movement and communication across distances that we think of as impassable, across regions that we think of as isolated? What if, for a time, the world was more connected than it has been at any point since, more connected even than it is now, because the rivers provided natural highways that required no technology beyond the boat, no infrastructure beyond the knowledge of where the water flows? This is a radical idea. It challenges our fundamental assumptions about how human populations spread, how cultures developed, how ideas were transmitted. The standard model is diffusion. Humans originated in Africa, migrated outward in waves, slowly spreading across the continents, adapting to new environments, developing new cultures, each group becoming more isolated, more distinct as they moved farther from the origin point. Contact between distant groups was minimal. Innovation was independent. Similarities between cultures are explained either by universal human psychology or by the slow, generational transmission of ideas along trade routes that took centuries to cover the distances involved. This model sees the ancient world as fragmented, as a patchwork of isolated or semi-isolated groups, each developing in its own way, each creating its own solutions to the challenges of survival and organization. But what if the rivers tell a different story? What if, during the periods when the ancient river systems were active, the world was not fragmented but networked? What if groups separated by thousands of miles were in more regular contact than we imagine? Not because they were walking across deserts or hacking through jungles, but because they were traveling along rivers, waterways that connected distant regions, that made the journey not easy but possible, not immediate but achievable. Think about what rivers do. They connect highlands to lowlands. They connect interiors to coasts. They connect different climate zones, different ecosystems, different resource bases. A river that runs from mountains to ocean can allow a group living on the coast to travel inland, to access materials and foods that do not exist in their home environment. And it allows groups living inland to access the coast, to obtain salt, seafood, shells, all the resources of the ocean. Rivers create exchange. Rivers create connection. And if the river networks were extensive enough, if they reached far enough, if they interconnected in ways we do not currently recognize, they could have facilitated movements and exchanges on scales much larger than we typically assume for prehistoric periods. There is evidence that suggests this happened. Evidence of materials found far from their sources, in contexts that predate the trade networks we know about. Obsidian from Anatolia found in Neolithic sites hundreds of miles away. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan found in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. Jade from specific quarries in Central America distributed across Mesoamerica. Shells from the Pacific found in archaeological sites deep in the Amazon. These movements of materials require trade, require contact, require routes. And while we often imagine these routes as overland trails, as pack animals carrying goods across mountains and deserts, the simpler explanation, the more efficient explanation, is water. Rivers, coasts, waterways that allow the transport of bulk goods, that make possible the movement not just of small luxury items but of large quantities of materials, of people, of ideas. And if people were moving along these river networks, if they were using them for trade, for migration, for communication, then what we should find archaeologically is settlement patterns that follow the rivers. We should find sites clustered along watercourses, especially at strategic points. At confluences, at portages, at places where rivers transition from navigable to non-navigable, at the heads of deltas, at natural harbors. And this is exactly what we find. But not just along the rivers that exist today. Also along the rivers that no longer exist. The settlements are there, revealed by LiDAR, but they make no sense in the current landscape. They are in the middle of nowhere, far from any water source, in locations that seem irrational unless you overlay the map of ancient rivers. And then they make perfect sense. They are not in the middle of nowhere. They are on the banks of rivers that once flowed. They are at confluences that once existed. They are part of networks that once functioned but no longer do. Imagine a map not of the world as it is now, but of the world as it was 8,000 years ago, during the wetter climate of the early Holocene. On this map, the Sahara is not a desert but a landscape of rivers and lakes. The Arabian Peninsula is not a barren waste but a region of grasslands with flowing streams. The interior of Australia has river systems comparable to those of modern Europe. India has not one great river system but two, the Ganges and the Sarasvati, both massive, both life-supporting. The Amazon basin is not just drained by the Amazon but by a network of smaller rivers and canals that have been engineered to connect different watersheds. Central America is crisscrossed with causeways and water management systems that turn seasonal swamps into permanent transportation routes. And all of these rivers, all of these waterways are being used. People are living along them. People are traveling on them. People are building boats, developing navigation techniques, learning the rhythms of the water, teaching their children where the currents are strong and where they are gentle, where the channels are deep and where they are shallow, where the dangerous creatures live and where the fish are plentiful. And the knowledge is cumulative. Each generation adds to it. Each journey reveals more. And over time, over centuries, the knowledge becomes comprehensive. It becomes a mental map, a shared understanding of the waterways, of how to move through them, of what resources are available where, of which communities are friendly and which are not. This mental map is not written down. Cannot be written down because writing does not exist yet or is only just being invented, and the map is too complex, too nuanced, too fluid to be captured in early writing systems. So it is preserved orally. It is taught through stories, through songs, through rituals that encode the information in memorable forms. The ancestors who traveled these routes are remembered. The places they stopped are remembered. The dangers they faced and overcame are remembered. And the information is passed down generation to generation, embedded in the mythology, in the foundation stories, in the accounts of how the people came to be where they are. And when the rivers dry up, when the climate changes, when the networks collapse, the stories remain. They no longer correspond to the physical landscape. They no longer serve as practical guides. But they persist because they are sacred, because they connect the people to their ancestors, because they define who they are and where they came from. And we, millennia later, with our satellite imaging and our LiDAR and our archaeological surveys, we are finally able to see what the stories have been describing all along. The rivers that were, the networks that existed, the connections that made the ancient world, for a time, more unified, more interactive, more sophisticated than we ever imagined. But who built the infrastructure? Who engineered the causeways, the canals, the water management systems that the LiDAR is revealing? This is where the evidence becomes tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure. Because while we can see the results of their work, while we can map the systems they created, we have very little direct evidence of who they were, what they called themselves, what languages they spoke, what beliefs they held. They left no writing that we can read. They left no monumental architecture that has survived in recognizable form. What they left are the earthworks, the modifications to the landscape, the traces of engineering that are visible only from above, only with technology that did not exist until the 21st century. They are the invisible architects of ancient infrastructure, the engineers of networks that functioned for centuries or millennia and then were abandoned, forgotten, erased from history. Or perhaps not entirely erased. Perhaps they are remembered, but not in the ways we expect. Not as historical figures, not as dynasties or empires, but as something else. As the ancestors, as the first people, as the ones who came before. Because every culture has stories about a time before, a time when things were different, when the world was younger, when the ancestors did things that the current generation cannot do or does not know how to do. And these stories are often dismissed as mythology, as the inevitable tendency of cultures to imagine a golden age, a time of heroes and wonders that never actually existed. But what if some of these stories are true? What if the ancestors really did do things that later generations could not replicate? Not because the ancestors were magical or superhuman, but because the ancestors were living in a different world, a world where the rivers flowed and the networks existed and the knowledge of how to use them was still intact. What if the decline from the Golden Age is not a moral or spiritual decline but a geographical and climatic one? A shift from a wetter, more connected world to a drier, more fragmented one. Consider the Harappan civilization again. At its height, around 2500 BCE, it was one of the most extensive civilizations in the world, with cities that featured advanced urban planning, standardized weights and measures, sophisticated drainage systems, and trade networks that reached Mesopotamia and Central Asia. And then, around 1900 BCE, it declined. The cities were gradually abandoned. The writing disappeared. The trade networks collapsed. And the reasons for this decline are still debated. Some scholars point to climate change, to the drying up of the Sarasvati River, to a shift in monsoon patterns that made the region less hospitable. Others point to invasions, to conflicts, to social upheaval. But whatever the cause, the result was clear. The civilization that had thrived along the rivers of northwestern India faded away, leaving behind ruins and artifacts but no continuous tradition, no historical memory that was passed down through writing. The Harappan script has never been deciphered. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know their stories, their myths, their explanations for why they built what they built and organized their society as they did. They are anonymous, but they are not forgotten. Because the people who lived in that region after the Harappans, the Vedic peoples who composed the earliest Hindu texts, they have stories about a great river, about cities along its banks, about ancestors who lived there. They have the memory of the Sarasvati. And while they did not know the Harappans as the Harappans, they knew something. They knew that people had lived along that river, that the river had been important, that something significant had been lost when the river dried up. The memory was preserved, not as history but as sacred geography, as mythology, as part of the foundational narrative of the culture. And because it was preserved, we can now connect it to the archaeological and geological evidence. We can say, yes, the river was there. Yes, the civilization was there. Yes, the stories are based on something real. The mythology is not fantasy. It is garbled history, history that has been passed down through oral tradition for so long that the details are confused. The chronology is uncertain, but the core truth remains. This happened. This was real. We are remembering, and this pattern repeats across the world. In the Americas, indigenous groups have stories about ancestors who built the mounds, the earthworks, the canals. And for centuries, settlers and scholars refused to believe these stories, insisting that the indigenous people they encountered could not possibly be the descendants of the builders, that the structures must have been created by some other vanished race. Phoenicians, Vikings, Atlanteans, anyone but the actual ancestors of the people who were saying, "Our ancestors built these." But the evidence now makes clear that the stories were true. The ancestors did build them. The oral tradition preserved the truth. And the refusal to believe it was not based on evidence but on prejudice, on the assumption that indigenous peoples were not capable of such achievements, on the colonial narrative that positioned European civilization as uniquely advanced and everyone else as primitive. But the LiDAR, the archaeology, the DNA evidence, all of it confirms what the oral traditions have been saying. We built this. We were here. We had sophisticated societies, complex systems, extensive networks. And when those systems collapsed, we remembered. We kept the stories. We passed them down. And we are still here, still telling them, still waiting for you to listen. So who were the river engineers? We do not know in most cases. We do not know their names, their languages, their political structures. What we know is their work. And their work suggests organization, knowledge, foresight, cooperation on scales that required social structures more complex than bands of hunter-gatherers, but perhaps different from the hierarchical civilizations we are familiar with from the historical record. Perhaps these were network societies, decentralized, organized around the river systems themselves, with communities maintaining their independence but cooperating for mutual benefit, sharing knowledge of the waterways, coordinating efforts to manage floods and droughts, coming together for trade and ceremony but not unified under a single ruler or capital city. This is a different model of civilization, one that leaves fewer traces in the archaeological record because it does not build monumental palaces or temples, because it does not concentrate wealth and power in a single location, because its infrastructure is spread out along the rivers, embedded in the landscape, not concentrated in urban centers. It is a civilization defined by its networks, not by its nodes. And when the networks fail, when the rivers change, the civilization does not collapse into a single dramatic ruin. It disperses, it fragments, it transitions back into smaller-scale organization. And the memory of the network becomes myth, becomes the story of the ancestors, becomes the silver rivers, the paths of water, the routes that once connected us but are now lost. And perhaps this is why the stories have such power, such resonance. Because they are not just about the past. They are about loss. They are about disconnection. They are about a time when we were more united, more networked, more capable of moving through the world, and about the trauma of losing that, of watching the rivers dry up, of seeing the connections break, of having to adapt to a more fragmented, more isolated, more difficult world. The silver rivers are not just geographical features. They are symbols of what we once had and what we lost. They are the paths that are no longer available to us, the routes that have been closed, the networks that have collapsed. And the longing for them, the preservation of them in myth and story, is a longing for reconnection, for a time when the world was more accessible, when movement was possible, when we were not so alone. Let us pause here, in the middle of our journey, and consider what we are suggesting. We are suggesting that human history, the story we tell about how we came to be where we are, is incomplete. That the maps are wrong, not entirely but significantly, because they show only the geography of today and ignore the geographies of the past, the landscapes that existed during periods when the climate was different, when the rivers flowed in different patterns, when the connections between regions were not as they are now. We are suggesting that during some of these periods, particularly the early Holocene, the period after the last ice age but before the rise of the civilizations we know from history, there were human populations that were more organized, more networked, more sophisticated than we have typically assumed. That they were not just surviving but thriving, not just adapting to their environments but shaping them, engineering waterways, managing resources, moving across distances that we think of as prohibitive but that were, with the right knowledge and the right tools, boats, navigation skills, understanding of the rivers, entirely possible. And we are suggesting that when the climate changed, when the rivers dried up or shifted course, when the networks collapsed, these populations did not disappear. They adapted. They moved. They fragmented into smaller groups. They continued, but in different forms, in different places. And they carried with them the memory of what had been, the knowledge of the rivers that no longer flowed, the stories of the ancestors who had moved through a different world. And those stories, preserved in oral tradition, encoded in mythology, embedded in the sacred narratives of cultures across the globe, are the evidence that this happened. They are the testimony of the survivors. And we, with our technology, with our LiDAR and our satellite imaging and our archaeological methods, we are finally able to see what they have been telling us all along. The world was different. The rivers were there. The networks existed. We are remembering. This is not a fringe theory. This is not pseudo-archaeology. This is the emerging consensus in many areas of archaeological and geological research. The evidence is accumulating too rapidly, from too many different sources, to be ignored or dismissed. The LiDAR scans revealing lost cities in the Amazon, in Southeast Asia, in Central America. The satellite imaging revealing ancient river systems in the Sahara, in Arabia, in Australia. The genetic studies showing that human populations moved farther and faster than we thought, that there was more contact between distant groups, that the isolation we assumed did not exist to the degree we believed. The reanalysis of oral traditions, taking seriously the geographical and historical information they contain, testing their claims against the physical evidence and finding correlations. All of this is pointing in the same direction, toward a more complex, more interconnected, more dynamic human past than our textbooks describe, toward a recognition that the people who lived before writing, before cities, before the historical record, were not primitive. They were us. They were humans with the same intelligence, the same creativity, the same capacity for organization and innovation that we have. They simply lived in a different world, faced different challenges, developed different solutions. And some of those solutions, some of that knowledge was lost when the world changed, when the rivers dried up, when the networks collapsed. But not all of it was lost, because the stories remain. And the stories are data. They are messy data, filtered through generations of oral transmission, transformed by cultural and religious frameworks, mixed with symbolic and archetypal elements that make them difficult to interpret. But they are data nonetheless. And when we combine them with the physical evidence, when we overlay the myths with the maps, when we listen to what the indigenous peoples are saying about their own history, when we take seriously the possibility that oral tradition can preserve accurate information across millennia, we get a richer, more complete picture of the past. We get a history that includes not just the civilizations that left monumental ruins and written records, but also the civilizations that left earthworks and stories, the societies that organized around networks rather than capitals, the peoples who traveled the rivers that no longer flow. And this matters. It matters because history shapes identity. It shapes how we understand ourselves, where we come from, what we are capable of. If we believe that our ancestors were scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, isolated, struggling, barely surviving, then we see ourselves as the culmination of a long, slow climb from ignorance and helplessness to knowledge and power. We see ourselves as uniquely advanced, uniquely sophisticated, the peak of human achievement. But if we recognize that our ancestors were also organized, also capable of large-scale engineering and long-distance networking, also sophisticated in their understanding of the environment and their ability to shape it, then we see ourselves differently. We see ourselves as part of a continuum, not the endpoint. We see our current civilization not as unprecedented but as the latest in a series of rises and falls, of networked periods and fragmented periods, of times when the connections were strong and times when they broke. And this recognition brings humility. It brings the understanding that what we have built, impressive as it is not permanent, not guaranteed. It is dependent on conditions, climatic, environmental, social, that can change. And when they change, when the rivers of our time shift course or dry up, whether those rivers are actual waterways or the metaphorical networks of communication and trade that our civilization depends on, we too will face the choice that our ancestors faced: adapt or disperse. And the question becomes, what will we remember? What will we preserve? What stories will we tell about this time, about what we built, about what we lost, about who we were? This is why the silver rivers matter. This is why the vanished waterways, the ancient networks, the lost geographies of the past, are not just academic curiosities. They are mirrors. They are showing us ourselves, our own fragility, our own dependence on systems that feel permanent but are not. They are reminding us that the world changes, that what seems stable can shift, that the paths we rely on can close. And they are also showing us resilience, because the people who lost their rivers did not simply die. They moved, they adapted, they remembered, they carried forward what they could, preserving the knowledge, telling the stories, passing on the understanding that even when the connections are broken, even when the networks collapse, even when the world we knew is gone, we continue. We find new paths. We build new systems. We remember the old ones not with despair but with respect, with recognition that they were part of our journey, that they shaped us, that they made us who we are. And we use that memory, that knowledge of what was, to inform what comes next, to build better, to adapt more successfully, to ensure that the next network, the next civilization, the next attempt at creating connection and meaning and order in a chaotic world benefits from the lessons of all that came before. Now let us turn to the technology that is revealing these hidden geographies, because understanding the tool helps us understand what it is showing us and why we are only now able to see what has been there all along. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, works by sending pulses of laser light from an aircraft or drone toward the ground and measuring how long it takes for the light to bounce back. Different surfaces return the light at different times. Trees, buildings, hills, all create distinct signatures. And by collecting millions of these measurements and processing them with sophisticated software, researchers can create extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional maps of the terrain. But the real power of LiDAR is its ability to filter out vegetation. It can distinguish between the light that bounces off the forest canopy and the light that penetrates to the ground. And by removing the canopy from the data, it reveals what lies beneath. The actual contours of the earth, the subtle rises and depressions, the marks left by human activity even when they are covered by centuries of forest growth. This is revolutionary. Before LiDAR, mapping archaeological sites in heavily forested regions required physically surveying every square meter, cutting transects through the jungle, hoping to stumble upon structures or earthworks that might be hidden beneath the undergrowth. It was slow, expensive, labor-intensive, and necessarily limited in scope. You could survey a small area in detail, but you could not see the larger patterns, the regional organization, the networks that connected sites across distances measured in kilometers or hundreds of kilometers. But LiDAR changes this. It allows researchers to map entire landscapes, to see the patterns, to recognize that what looked like isolated sites are actually parts of larger systems, connected by causeways, by canals, by lines of settlement that follow invisible routes. Invisible to us now, but clearly visible to the people who live there because the routes followed the rivers, the waterways that no longer exist but that shaped the landscape in ways the LiDAR can detect. And what the LiDAR is showing, in region after region, is that the landscapes we thought we knew are far more complex than we imagined. In the Yucatan, where archaeologists have been studying the Maya for over a century, LiDAR has revealed that the known cities are only a fraction of what existed. There are structures, roads, agricultural systems covering areas that were thought to be empty jungle. In Cambodia, LiDAR has shown that Angkor was not a collection of isolated temples but a vast urban complex covering over 1,000 square kilometers, with water management systems, reservoirs, canals, all integrated into a single engineered landscape. In the Amazon, LiDAR is revealing earthworks, causeways, settlement mounds, arranged in geometric patterns, connected by raised roadways, suggesting populations far larger and more organized than anyone had suspected. And everywhere, the patterns are the same. Evidence of engineering, of water management, of networks oriented around waterways, some of which still flow but many of which have vanished, leaving only the traces of their former courses, the depressions in the earth where water once ran, the raised banks that once kept the channels defined. But LiDAR is not just revealing lost structures. It is revealing lost rivers. And this is the key insight, because when you map the ancient settlements, when you see where people chose to build, you can infer where the resources were. People settle near water. This is universal. Water is life. You need it for drinking, for agriculture, for fishing, for transportation. And so settlements cluster near rivers, near lakes, near springs. And when you see settlements in places where there is no water today, you know something has changed. Either the people were able to transport water from a distance, which is possible but expensive and requires sophisticated infrastructure, or the water was there when they settled and has since disappeared. And the LiDAR, by mapping the terrain in such detail, can reveal the traces of the former watercourses, the slight depressions, the ancient channels, the river valleys that are now dry but that once carried water and that once supported the communities whose remains we are finding. This is how we are reconstructing the ancient geographies. By combining the LiDAR data with satellite imagery, with ground surveys, with geological analysis, we are creating maps of the past. We are showing where the rivers flowed 5,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. We are identifying the watersheds, the drainage patterns, the connections between water sources. And we are seeing that during certain periods, particularly the early to mid-Holocene, the world was much wetter than it is today, that rivers flowed in places that are now deserts, that lakes filled basins that are now dry, that the distribution of water across the continents was fundamentally different. And this different distribution created different possibilities for human settlement and movement. It created corridors through regions that are now impassable. It created connections between areas that are now isolated. It created a world in which the rivers were the highways, the natural transportation network that required no construction, only knowledge. And the people who lived in that world, who learned the rivers, who traveled them, who built their societies around them, they created something remarkable. They created networks. And those networks, for a time, allowed exchange, communication, movement on scales that we do not typically associate with prehistory, with the period before writing, before cities, before the state societies that we think of as the foundation of civilization. But then the climate changed. The Holocene climate optimum, the warm, wet period that followed the end of the last ice age, peaked around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago and then began to wane. The monsoons weakened. The rainfall decreased. The rivers began to shrink. And the networks that depended on them began to fail. Some rivers dried up entirely. Others changed course, shifting away from the settlements that had grown on their banks. And the people who depended on these rivers faced a crisis. Some adapted, developing new technologies, wells, cisterns, irrigation systems, to survive in the drier conditions. Some moved, migrating to regions where water was still available, to the great river valleys that still flowed, the Nile, the Tigris-Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, where they contributed to the rise of the civilizations we know from history. And some simply vanished from the archaeological record, their populations declining, their settlements abandoned, their stories lost except for the traces in the earth and the fragments preserved in the myths of later cultures. And this is the pattern we see repeated across the globe. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the rise of the first historical civilizations, there was a widespread crisis, a period of drought and climate instability that affected regions across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The Sahara completed its transition to desert. The Sarasvati River dried up. River systems across Arabia, Central Asia, and the interior of Australia diminished or disappeared. And in the wake of this crisis, the maps were redrawn. The old networks, the ones based on the ancient rivers, collapsed. And new systems, new civilizations, emerged in the places where water was still abundant. These are the civilizations we know from history: Egypt, Sumer, the Harappans, the Shang dynasty in China. They are not the first civilizations. They are the civilizations that survived, that adapted, that rebuilt in new locations after the old networks failed. They are the inheritors of the knowledge, the technologies, the social structures that had been developed during the networked periods, during the time when the ancient rivers flowed. And they preserved, in their myths and stories, the memory of what came before, the memory of the silver rivers, the paths of water, the networks that once connected the world. There is a specific example that illustrates this pattern with remarkable clarity, and it is worth examining in detail because it shows how the combination of technology, mythology, and archaeology can reveal a story that would otherwise remain hidden. This is the story of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, a vast expanse of sand and scrubland that seems, at first glance, to be an unlikely place for ancient civilizations. But appearances deceive, because beneath the sand, revealed by satellite imaging and confirmed by ground surveys, is a network of ancient river channels, massive waterways that once drained the interior of southern Africa, that once carried water from the highlands to the coast, that once supported ecosystems and human populations that thrived in a landscape utterly unlike the desert we see today. These are the channels of the Makgadikgadi system, rivers that flowed into a vast lake, Lake Makgadikgadi, which at its maximum extent was larger than modern Lake Victoria, one of the largest lakes in the world. This lake existed until relatively recently in geological terms. It was still filling and emptying cyclically as recently as 10,000 years ago. And around its shores, in the valleys of the rivers that fed it, there is archaeological evidence of human occupation, of settlements, of a way of life based on fishing, on hunting the animals that came to the water, on utilizing the plant resources that flourished in the wetland environments. And then, as the climate dried, the lake shrank, the rivers diminished, and eventually, the lake disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a vast salt pan, the Makgadikgadi pans, one of the largest salt flats in the world, a shimmering white expanse that is utterly inhospitable to human life for most of the year, flooded briefly during the rainy season and then drying to a hard, cracked surface under the relentless sun. And what happened to the people who lived around the lake? Some of them adapted, becoming the Khoisan peoples, the San and Khoi groups who developed the ability to survive in the harsh conditions of the Kalahari, who learned to find water in the most unlikely places, who preserved an extraordinary knowledge of the desert ecology, who maintained a way of life based on hunting and gathering that allowed them to persist in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. But genetic studies suggest that other groups moved, that there was a significant migration out of the region around the time the lake was drying up, that populations moved north and east and west, carrying with them the memory of the lake, the knowledge of the rivers, the stories of a time when the land was green and the water was abundant. And those stories persist. In the oral traditions of southern African peoples, there are accounts of a great lake, of rivers that flowed from the mountains, of a time when the ancestors lived in a different landscape, when life was easier, when the rains came and the water was everywhere. And for a long time, these stories were dismissed as legend, as myth, as the nostalgic imaginings of peoples who had been pushed into marginal environments by drought or conflict. But the satellite data proves them true. The lake was there. The rivers were there. The stories are not myths. They are history, and this pattern. Ancient rivers, ancient lakes, populations that thrived and then dispersed when the water disappeared, stories that preserve the memory. This pattern is not unique to southern Africa. It appears across the Sahara, where the rock art in the central desert depicts a landscape of rivers and lakes, hippos and crocodiles, people fishing from boats, all in a region that has been utterly dry for thousands of years. It appears in Arabia, where the rivers of Eden, the waterways mentioned in ancient Middle Eastern texts, may be references to real rivers that flowed through the Arabian Peninsula during the early Holocene. Rivers that no longer exist but that once supported populations, that once connected the highlands to the coast, that once made the Arabian Peninsula not a barrier but a corridor, a route of migration and trade connecting Africa to Asia. It appears in Australia, where Aboriginal traditions speak of ancestors traveling along water routes through the interior, routes that make no sense in the current landscape but that align perfectly with the ancient river systems revealed by geological surveys. And it appears in the Americas, where indigenous traditions reference waterways, networks of canals and causeways, movements of peoples along rivers that once connected regions that are now separated by impassable terrain. And the question that emerges from all of this evidence, from all of these patterns, is, what if these were not isolated developments? What if, during the periods when the climate was wetter, when the rivers flowed, when the lakes filled, there was a degree of connectivity across regions that we do not typically associate with prehistory? What if the movements of peoples, the exchange of ideas and technologies, the development of social and organizational structures, was happening on a much larger scale than we have imagined, facilitated by the rivers, by the natural transportation network that the water provided? What if the story we tell about human civilization, the story that begins with isolated groups slowly developing agriculture and then cities and then states, is missing a chapter, a prologue in which people were already networked, already moving, already exchanging, not because they had advanced technologies in the modern sense, but because they had boats and they had knowledge and they had the rivers? This is not to say there was a single global civilization. This is not about Atlantis or lost continents or ancient aliens. This is about recognizing that human populations, even before the invention of writing, even before the rise of the state societies we call civilizations, were capable of organization, of engineering, of long-distance communication and exchange. That they were not primitive. That they were not isolated. That they were connected, networked, sophisticated in their understanding of their environments and their ability to move through them. And that the reason we have not recognized this until now is not because the evidence was not there, but because we were not looking for it. We were looking for cities, for monumental architecture, for writing, for the markers of civilization as we have defined it based on the historical civilizations we know. But we were not looking for networks. We were not looking for water management systems spread across hundreds of square kilometers. We were not looking for settlement patterns that only make sense when you reconstruct the ancient river systems. We were not listening to the myths, the oral traditions, the stories that were telling us all along. The rivers were there. The ancestors traveled them. The networks existed. We are remembering. And now, with LiDAR, with satellite imaging, with new archaeological methods and new ways of analyzing oral traditions, we are finally able to see what we were missing. We are finally able to map the ancient geographies. We are finally able to reconstruct the networks. And what we are finding is that the human past is far more complex, far more interconnected, far more dynamic than our narratives have allowed. The story is not a simple progression from isolated bands to settled villages to cities to states. The story is a cycle, or rather multiple cycles, of networking and fragmentation, of connection and isolation, of periods when the conditions, climatic, environmental, allowed for the development of extensive networks, and periods when those conditions changed and the networks collapsed, forcing populations to adapt, to move, to start again in new configurations. And through all of this, through all the cycles, the memory persists. The stories are told. The knowledge is preserved, even if imperfectly, even if mixed with myth and symbol. And when we learn to read these stories, when we combine them with the physical evidence, we recover not just facts about the past but a deeper understanding of who we are, how we got here, and what we are capable of. We recover the silver rivers. And in recovering them, we recover ourselves. Let us now consider the implications of all this for our understanding of cultural diffusion, of how ideas and technologies spread across the ancient world. The traditional model is wave-like. A new idea emerges in one location, and then it spreads outward gradually, from neighbor to neighbor, taking generations or centuries to cover significant distances. Agriculture, according to this model, was invented independently in a few locations: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and then spread from these centers, carried by migrating farmers or adopted by hunter-gatherers who learned the techniques from their neighbors. Metallurgy, pottery, writing, all of these are assumed to have diffused in similar ways, with independent invention in a few places and then gradual spread. And this model explains many patterns we see in the archaeological record. But it does not explain all of them. It does not explain why certain ideas, certain technologies, certain symbolic systems appear in widely separated locations at roughly the same time, in contexts that suggest not gradual diffusion but either independent invention, which requires us to believe that humans in different parts of the world just happen to make the same discoveries at the same time, or rapid transmission across distances that the diffusion model says should have taken much longer to cross. But what if the rivers provide a different model? What if, during the periods when the ancient river networks were functioning, ideas could spread faster, farther than the traditional model allows? Because rivers are fast. You can travel farther in a day by boat than you can travel in a week on foot. And if there are networks of rivers, if they connect across watersheds, if there are portages at the divides, then you can move from one river system to another, from one region to another, covering distances measured in thousands of kilometers, not in generations but in months. And if people are moving this fast, if traders, migrants, explorers are traveling along these networks, then ideas move with them. Technologies move with them. Stories move with them. And the receiving communities do not have to wait for their neighbors to slowly pass along a technique. They can receive it directly, from travelers who have come from distant lands, who bring with them not just goods but knowledge, stories, perspectives from other places. And this creates a different pattern of diffusion, one that is less wave-like and more networked, one in which certain nodes, the confluences, the major river junctions, the places where different waterways meet, become hubs of exchange, places where ideas from multiple regions come together, mix, are transformed, and are then carried outward along the rivers to other places. This networked model explains patterns that the wave model struggles with. It explains why pottery styles that are similar appear in widely separated locations at roughly the same time. It explains why certain symbolic motifs, spirals, zigzags, concentric circles, appear across the world in prehistoric art, in contexts that suggest not a single origin and gradual diffusion but multiple nodes of a network, places connected by the rivers, places where people were exchanging not just goods but ideas, stories, ways of seeing and representing the world. It explains why metallurgical techniques that are complex, that require specific knowledge of ores and temperatures and processes, appear in regions that supposedly had no contact, that are separated by oceans or deserts. Because if the rivers connected them, if there were travelers moving along the networks, then the knowledge could have been transmitted, not as a written formula but as practical knowledge, as apprenticeship, as one metalworker teaching another, as the kind of knowledge transfer that leaves no trace in the archaeological record except the results. The bronze, the copper, the gold, appearing in places where the techniques should not yet have arrived according to the timelines we have constructed based on the wave model. And the rivers explain something else, something even more fundamental. They explain languages. Because one of the great mysteries of historical linguistics is the distribution of language families, the fact that languages that are clearly related, that share common ancestors, are sometimes found in widely separated locations, separated by geography that would seem to preclude contact. The Indo-European languages, for example, stretch from Iceland to India, from Ireland to Iran. And the conventional explanation is migration. Speakers of Proto-Indo-European, a hypothetical ancestral language, migrated from a homeland somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, spreading outward in waves, conquering or assimilating the populations they encountered, carrying their language with them. And this probably happened. But the details are murky, the timelines are debated, and there are anomalies, linguistic and genetic, that do not fit neatly into the migration model. But what if the rivers played a role? What if, before the migrations, before the conquests, there were already networks, river networks that connected the steppes to the Middle East, to South Asia, to Europe? Networks along which people were moving, trading, communicating, creating a zone of interaction that facilitated the spread of languages, of ideas, of genes, long before the historical migrations we know about? This would explain why the linguistic and genetic patterns are so complex, why they show evidence of multiple contacts, multiple mixings, multiple flows in different directions. Because the rivers create complexity. They create networks. And networks do not have simple, unidirectional flows. They have hubs, multiple routes, backflows, eddies. They create patterns that look less like waves spreading from a center and more like webs, interconnected, multidirectional, dynamic. And if this is true, if the rivers were facilitating these connections, then our maps of the ancient world need to change. We need to stop thinking of regions as isolated, as separated by the deserts or the mountains or the oceans that separate them today, and start thinking of them as they were during the periods when the rivers flowed, when the climate was different, when the barriers we see now were not barriers but were traversable, were penetrable, were crossed regularly by people following the water. We need to create dynamic maps, maps that change with time, that show the ancient geographies, the lost rivers, the networks that existed and then vanished. And when we do this, when we visualize the world as it was rather than as it is, we see a different human story. We see connection instead of isolation. We see exchange instead of stagnation. We see movement instead of fixity. And we see that the people of the past were not waiting, huddled in their isolated valleys, for the slow diffusion of ideas from distant centers. They were traveling. They were exploring. They were meeting each other, exchanging goods and stories and knowledge, building networks that spanned continents, networks that functioned as long as the rivers flowed, and that collapsed when the rivers dried up, leaving only the memory, the myths, the stories of the silver rivers, the paths of water, the routes the ancestors traveled, the connections that once were and might be again. And so we arrive at the deepest question, the one that has been hovering at the edges of this entire investigation. If these networks existed, if people were connected across such vast distances, if there was this level of organization and exchange, then why do we not have more evidence? Why are there no written records? Why are there no monumental cities that clearly demonstrate the existence of these far-flung connections? Why has this story remained hidden, relegated to the realm of myth and oral tradition, only now being revealed by technology that can see through the forests and strip away the accumulated soil of millennia? The answer, perhaps, is that we have been looking for the wrong things. We have been looking for civilizations that look like the civilizations we know: Egypt, Rome, China. Civilizations with capitals, with kings, with hierarchies, with monumental architecture that proclaims power and permanence. But what if the river civilizations were different? What if they were organized differently, structured not around centers of power but around networks of exchange? What if they were decentralized, with no single capital, no single ruler, but rather a web of interconnected communities, each maintaining its autonomy but participating in a larger system of trade, communication, ritual? This is a different model of social organization, one that leaves different traces in the archaeological record. It does not produce pyramids or palaces. It produces earthworks, causeways, water management systems. Produces networks, not monuments. And networks are harder to see, especially when they are buried under forests or deserts, especially when the key element of the network, the rivers, no longer exists. And this model fits with what we know about many prehistoric societies. The mound-building cultures of North America, for example, created vast earthwork complexes, geometric structures covering acres, connected by causeways, aligned with celestial phenomena, clearly requiring coordinated labor and sophisticated knowledge. But they did not build cities in the sense we typically use the term. They did not have dense urban populations living in permanent stone structures. They had dispersed settlements, with the earthworks serving as ceremonial centers, as gathering places, as nodes in a network that connected communities across the river valleys of the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri. And when the Europeans arrived, they found this difficult to understand. They could not conceive of a civilization without cities, without kings, without the markers of power they were familiar with. And so they assumed the mounds must have been built by someone else, some lost race, because the native peoples they encountered, who insisted the mounds were built by their ancestors, did not fit the European definition of civilized. But the mounds are there. The networks are there. The evidence of organization, of cooperation, of sophisticated engineering and astronomical knowledge is undeniable. It is simply a different kind of civilization, one organized around networks, around seasonal gatherings, around the rivers that connected the communities and provided the resources. And the same pattern appears elsewhere. In the Amazon, the Lidar revealed earthworks are not cities but networks. In Angkor, while there are temple centers, the real marvel is the water management system, the network of canals and reservoirs that connected the landscape, that made possible the support of large populations dispersed across a region rather than concentrated in a single urban core. In the Sahara, during the periods when it was green, the evidence suggests populations that were mobile, that followed the rivers and the grasslands, that built impermanent structures, that left light traces in the archaeological record, but that, the rock art suggests, had rich cultural and ceremonial lives, had social organization, had knowledge systems that were passed down through generations. These are civilizations of the network, civilizations of the river, civilizations that thrived as long as the rivers flowed and that dispersed when the rivers dried up, leaving behind not ruins that proclaim permanence but traces that whisper. We were here. We knew this place. We moved through it. We connected. We remembered. And if we accept this, if we recognize that civilization can take forms other than the urban, hierarchical model we are familiar with, then we must also accept that the history of civilization is longer, more complex, more varied than we have imagined. That the rises and falls we chart in our timelines, the rise of Sumer, the fall of Rome, the rise and fall of countless dynasties and empires, these are not the only story. These are the stories of centralized civilizations, of societies that concentrated power and resources in ways that made them visible, that made them memorable, that made them historical. But alongside these, or before these, or between these, there were other stories, stories of network societies, of river-based civilizations, of peoples who organized their lives around the rhythms of water, who built infrastructure that served the collective rather than glorified the individual, who created connections rather than monuments. And these stories are harder to recover because the networks are invisible once the rivers disappear, because the knowledge was preserved in oral tradition rather than in writing, because the structures were made of earth and wood rather than stone. But they are no less real. They are no less important. They are, in many ways, more important because they show us different possibilities, different ways of being human, different ways of organizing society. They show us that the path we have taken, the path of urbanization, of centralization, of hierarchy, is not the only path. That there were other ways. And that those ways, while they did not survive, while they collapsed when the rivers dried up, left traces, left memories, left stories. And those stories are worth hearing, worth preserving, worth integrating into our understanding of who we are and where we came from. Because the story of the river civilizations is not just a story about the past. It is a story about resilience and adaptation. It is a story about what happens when the systems we depend on fail, when the networks collapse, when the resources we take for granted disappear. And it is a story about memory, about how we preserve knowledge across catastrophes, across dark ages, across periods when the connections are lost and each community is isolated, struggling to survive. The oral traditions, the myths, the stories about the silver rivers, the paths of water, the routes the ancestors traveled, these are not fantasies. These are survival mechanisms. These are the ways human communities keep knowledge alive when there are no books, no libraries, no institutions to preserve it. They encode the knowledge in stories, in songs, in rituals that are performed generation after generation, that carry forward the essential information. The rivers were there. The ancestors knew them. The connections existed. And if we remember, if we keep the stories alive, then one day when the conditions change again, when the rivers flow again, or when new technologies allow us to see what was hidden, we will be able to recognize what we lost. We will be able to understand what was. And we will be able to learn from it, to take the wisdom of the ancestors and apply it to our own time, to our own challenges, to our own need for connection, for networks, for systems that serve the collective rather than the individual, that create resilience rather than fragility. Let us descend now into a more personal register, into the feeling of all this, into what it means not just intellectually but emotionally, spiritually, to contemplate these lost geographies, these vanished rivers, these networks that once connected our ancestors and now exist only as traces in the earth and fragments in the stories. Because this is not just about correcting historical timelines or updating archaeological theories. This is about loss. This is about disconnection. This is about the feeling that something has been taken from us, something essential, some part of our human inheritance that we did not even know we had lost until the technology revealed it, until the lidar stripped away the forests and showed us the channels where water used to flow, the pathways our ancestors used to travel, the connections that used to exist. There is a grief in this, a recognition that the world our ancestors knew is gone, not just gone but vanished so completely that we forgot it was ever there, that we built our entire understanding of history on the assumption that the geography has always been as it is now, that the rivers that flow today are the rivers that have always flowed, that the deserts have always been deserts, that the barriers that separate us have always been barriers. But they have not. The world was different, and the people who lived in that different world, who knew the rivers that no longer flow, who traveled the paths that no longer exist, they are trying to tell us. They encoded it in their stories. They preserved it in their myths. They passed it down through generations, keeping alive the memory of a time when the world was more connected, when movement was possible, when the water created corridors through landscapes that are now impassable. And we, for so long, dismissed these stories. We called them myths, legends, fantasies. We said, there is no evidence. We said, the geography does not support it. We said, they were primitive peoples imagining a past that never existed. But we were wrong. The stories were true. The rivers were there. And the people who told the stories, who kept them alive through centuries and millennia of isolation and hardship, they were doing something profoundly important. They were maintaining the connection. They were refusing to forget. They were saying, we know where we come from. We know how we got here. We know that the world has changed. But we remember what it was. And now that we can see it, now that the technology has revealed the ancient geographies, we have a responsibility. A responsibility to listen to the stories with new ears. A responsibility to honor the peoples who preserved the memory, who insisted it was true even when no one believed them. A responsibility to integrate this knowledge into our understanding of history, to rewrite the narratives that have excluded or minimized the contributions of the river civilizations, of the network societies, of the peoples who organized their lives around waterways that no longer exist. And a responsibility to learn from this, to recognize that the world changes, that the systems we depend on are not permanent, that the networks we take for granted can collapse. And to ask ourselves, what are the rivers of our time? What are the networks that connect us, that allow our civilization to function, that we assume will always be there? And what will we do if they dry up, if they change course, if the climate or the economy or the social order shifts in ways that break the connections? Will we be able to adapt as our ancestors did? Will we be able to preserve the knowledge as they did? Will we be able to tell stories that keep alive the memory of what was, so that future generations, when they develop the technology to see what we cannot see, when they strip away the layers of time and reveal the infrastructure we built, the networks we depended on, will understand what happened, will honor our attempts, will learn from our mistakes? These are not abstract questions. These are urgent questions, because the signs are there. The rivers of our time, the rivers of oil, the rivers of data, the rivers of global trade, these are showing signs of stress, of instability, of potential failure. The climate is changing. The water is moving, shifting patterns that have been stable for centuries. The infrastructure we depend on is aging, fragile, vulnerable to disruption. And we are not prepared. We are not telling the stories. We are not preserving the knowledge of how things work, of where the resources come from, of what to do when the systems fail. We are assuming permanence. We are assuming that the world will always be as it is now. But the lesson of the ancient rivers is that the world does not stay the same. The world changes. And when it changes, the civilizations that are rigid, that are dependent on systems that cannot adapt, that have not preserved the knowledge of other ways of living, these civilizations collapse. They fragment. They disperse. And the knowledge is lost. Unless someone keeps the stories. Unless someone remembers. And this is where we return to the myths, to the oral traditions, to the stories about the silver rivers and the paths of water. Because these stories are not just about the past. They are about the future. They are warnings. They are saying, this has happened before. The world changed. The rivers dried up. The networks collapsed. And the people adapted, but at great cost. They lost much of what they had built. They lost the connections. They lost the ease of movement, the abundance of resources, the sense of being part of a larger whole. They became isolated, fragmented, reduced. But they survived. And they remembered. And they passed on the memory, encoded in stories that seem fantastical, that seem mythological, but that are trying to tell you, be prepared. The world can change. And when it does, you will need to know how to adapt. You will need to remember where you came from. You will need to preserve the knowledge. You will need to tell the stories. And so, as you listen to this, as you contemplate the lost rivers and the vanished networks, as you feel the weight of all that history, all that loss, all that memory preserved across millennia in the stories of peoples who had no writing, no monuments, no institutional means of preservation, only the human voice, the human memory, the human need to tell and to remember, as you feel all of this, know that you are part of the story. You are the one hearing it. You are the one who can carry it forward. You are the one who can integrate this knowledge into how you see the world, how you plan for the future, how you respond to the changes that are coming. The rivers are drying up. The networks are becoming fragile. The connections are under stress. And we need to remember. We need to preserve. We need to tell the stories. Because the future will need them. The future will need to know that this happened before, that civilizations rose and fell, that networks connected and collapsed, that the world changed and people adapted. And the stories will give them hope. The stories will give them guidance. The stories will say, you are not the first. You are not alone. Others have faced this, and they survived, and they remembered, and they passed it on. And now it is your turn to survive, to remember, to pass it on, to keep alive the silver rivers, the paths of water, the connections that make us human, that make us whole, that make us more than isolated individuals struggling alone, but part of a network, part of a web, part of a great ongoing human effort to understand the world, to move through it, to connect with each other across the distances, across the barriers, across the silence. This is what the rivers taught. This is what the stories preserve. This is what we must remember. And yet, even as we contemplate the loss, even as we feel the weight of the vanished rivers and the collapsed networks, there is also something else. Something unexpected. Something hopeful. Because the story of the rivers is not only a story of loss. It is also a story of rediscovery. It is also a story of revelation. It is the story of how, after millennia of forgetting, after centuries of dismissing the myths as fantasy, after generations of living in ignorance of the ancient geographies, we are finally beginning to see. The technology has caught up with the stories. The LiDAR, the satellites, the computing power that can process millions of data points and render them into maps. These have given us new eyes. Eyes that can see through time. Eyes that can penetrate the forests and the deserts and reveal what lies beneath. Eyes that can show us, with stunning clarity, that the stories were true. The rivers were there. The networks existed. The ancestors knew. And we are remembering. And this rediscovery is not passive. It is not just a matter of adding footnotes to history books or updating archaeological databases. It is transformative. It is changing how we see ourselves, how we understand our place in the long arc of human history, how we think about our relationship to the environment, to each other, to the past and the future. Because the rivers teach us resilience. They teach us adaptation. They teach us that civilizations do not follow a single trajectory, do not move in a straight line from primitive to advanced, from isolated to connected. They teach us that the path is cyclical, that there are periods of connection and periods of fragmentation, that there are rises and falls, that what is lost can sometimes be recovered, that what is forgotten can sometimes be remembered. And they teach us humility. They teach us that we are not the first, not the most advanced, not the culmination of history. They teach us that our ancestors were capable, sophisticated, knowledgeable in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. And they teach us that the world is not fixed, not stable, not unchanging. The world is dynamic. The geography shifts. The climate changes. The rivers come and go. And our civilizations, our networks, our systems, they are all dependent on conditions that are temporary, that can and will change. And we must be ready. We must be adaptable. We must be resilient. And the stories, the myths, the oral traditions, these are the textbooks of resilience. They are teaching us how to survive when the systems fail, how to preserve knowledge when the institutions collapse, how to maintain connections when the networks are broken. They are teaching us the importance of memory, of storytelling, of keeping alive the knowledge of what was so that we can learn from it, so that we can apply it, so that we do not have to start from zero when the changes come. The indigenous peoples who preserved these stories, who kept them alive through centuries of colonization, of suppression, of attempts to erase their cultures and their histories, they were doing something profoundly important. They were maintaining the archive. They were keeping the memory alive. And now, as the technology reveals that their stories were accurate, that the rivers they spoke of were real, that the networks they described existed, we owe them recognition. We owe them respect. We owe them our attention. We need to listen to the stories. We need to learn from the stories. We need to honor the peoples who preserved the stories, who insisted on their truth even when no one believed them, because they were right, and we were wrong, and the lesson in that is humbling, and necessary, and potentially transformative. Because if we can accept that the oral traditions were accurate about the rivers, about the ancient geographies, about the networks that once connected the world, then perhaps we need to take seriously other things the stories say. Perhaps we need to listen when indigenous peoples talk about sustainable practices, about living in balance with the environment, about managing resources in ways that do not deplete them, about organizing societies in ways that distribute power rather than concentrate it. Perhaps we need to recognize that the knowledge systems we have dismissed as primitive, as unscientific as folklore. Perhaps these systems contain wisdom that we have lost, that we need, that could help us navigate the challenges we are facing. Climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, the collapse of networks. These are the challenges our ancestors faced when the rivers dried up. And they survived. Not by clinging to the old systems, not by trying to force the environment to conform to their needs, but by adapting, by changing, by learning, by preserving what was essential and letting go of what was not. And they encoded this wisdom in their stories. And we need to listen. And this brings us to the final lesson of the rivers, the deepest teaching, the one that connects the past to the present to the future. The lesson is this: connection is essential. Networks matter. We survive not as isolated individuals, not as competing groups, but as interconnected communities, as parts of larger wholes, as nodes and networks that span distances, that bridge differences, that create resilience through diversity, through redundancy, through the multiple paths that networks provide. When the rivers flowed, they connected. They created networks. And the civilizations that thrived were the ones that used the networks, that maintained them, that cooperated to ensure the networks functioned. And when the rivers dried up, the civilizations that survived were the ones that adapted, that found new ways to connect, that maintained the memory of connection even when the physical networks were broken. And we, in our time, we have networks. We have systems of connection that are more extensive, more rapid, more powerful than anything the ancient world knew. We have technology that allows instant communication across the globe. We have transportation that moves goods and people across continents and oceans. We have information networks that give us access to the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. But these networks are fragile. They depend on infrastructure that is vulnerable. They depend on resources that are finite. They depend on social and political systems that are under stress. And if we are not careful, if we do not maintain them, if we do not adapt them to the changing conditions, they will fail. The rivers will dry up. The connections will break. And we will fragment, isolate, decline. But it does not have to be this way, because we have the stories. We have the memory. We have the knowledge that this has happened before and that people survived by adapting, by cooperating, by maintaining connections even when it was difficult. And we have the technology to see what was hidden, to understand what was lost, to learn from the past in ways that previous generations could not. We can map the ancient rivers. We can reconstruct the networks. We can test the stories against the physical evidence and find that they are true. And in doing so, we can learn. We can recognize the patterns. We can see that the challenges we face are not unprecedented, that the solutions we need are not unknown, that the wisdom we seek has been preserved, waiting for us to be ready to hear it, to understand it, to apply it. The silver rivers are not lost. They are here. They are in the stories. They are in the earth. They are in the memories of the peoples who kept them alive. And they are in us. in our ability to see patterns, to make connections, to adapt, to survive, to thrive. This is the inheritance of the rivers. This is what they give us. Not answers, but guidance. Not solutions, but possibilities. Not certainty, but hope. The hope that comes from knowing we are not the first, that others have faced what we face, that the knowledge has been preserved, that the stories are true, and that if we listen, if we remember, if we honor what was and learn from it, we can build what comes next. We can create new networks. We can find new paths. We can navigate the changes. We can survive. We can connect. We can thrive. This is the promise of the rivers. This is the gift of the stories. This is the hope we carry forward into the uncertain future, guided by the memory of what was, informed by the wisdom of the ancestors, connected to each other and to the earth and to the great ongoing human journey that the rivers, both physical and metaphorical, have always traced. The journey of connection, the journey of adaptation, the journey of remembering, the journey home. Now, as the night deepens and the journey through these hidden rivers nears its end, let us return one final time to the image that opened this exploration. The spiral of water, the current that carries, the flow that connects. Let us think about what it means to travel by river, to surrender to the current, to trust the water to carry you where you need to go. This is a different mode of movement than walking, than riding, than flying. Walking is individual, solitary, slow. You choose each step, control each movement, determine your own pace. Riding adds speed but requires an animal, a partnership, a negotiation with another living being. Flying is modern, technological, swift and powerful but disconnected from the earth, from the landscape you pass over. But traveling by river is something else. It is a collaboration with the earth itself, with the water, with the forces of gravity and geography that shape where the water flows. You cannot force a river to go where you want. You can only follow where it leads. You can paddle, steer, navigate. But ultimately, you are in the river's hands. You are part of its flow. And this mode of travel creates a different relationship with the landscape. When you walk, you see the land from ground level, from the perspective of the paths and the valleys, the forests and the hills. When you fly, you see it from above, abstracted into patterns and colors, divorced from the immediate experience of the place. But when you travel by river, you see it from the water's perspective. You see the banks rising on either side. You see the trees leaning over the current. You see the animals coming to drink. You see the sky reflected in the surface. You are in the landscape but also moving through it, experiencing it as a continuum, as a connected whole rather than a series of discrete locations. And this creates knowledge. Practical knowledge of where the water is swift and where it is slow, where the channels are deep and where they are shallow, where the obstacles are and how to navigate around them. But also relational knowledge, knowledge of how places connect, of how the water links highlands to lowlands, interiors to coasts, different ecosystems, different resources, different communities. The river is not just a route. It is a teacher. It is showing you how the world is organized, how the pieces fit together, how the flow of water creates the flow of life. And the people who lived along the ancient rivers, who traveled them, who built their societies around them, they had this knowledge. They knew the rivers intimately. They knew every bend, every rapid, every confluence. They knew when the water would be high and when it would be low. They knew which tributaries led where, which portages connected different watersheds, which communities could be found along which stretches. This knowledge was not written in books. It was embodied, lived, passed down through practice, through stories, through the experience of traveling the rivers generation after generation. And when the rivers dried up, when the routes were closed, this knowledge became useless in practical terms. You cannot travel a river that does not exist. You cannot navigate channels that are now dust. But the knowledge did not disappear. Transformed. It became story. It became myth. It became the silver rivers, the paths of water, the routes the ancestors walked. And in becoming story, it was preserved. It was kept alive. Not as practical navigation but as cultural memory, as identity, as a connection to the ancestors, to the time before, to the world that was. And we, now, with our technology, we are in a strange position. We can see the rivers again. We can map them. We can reconstruct the routes. We can confirm that the stories were accurate. But we cannot travel them. We cannot experience them as our ancestors did. The water is gone. The flow has stopped. We can only imagine what it was like to push off from the bank in a dugout canoe, to feel the current take you, to see the landscape unfold as the river carried you through it, to arrive at a settlement and be greeted by people who spoke a different language but who understood the river, who were part of the same network, who were connected to you through the water. We can only imagine. And in imagining, we are doing what the people who lost the rivers did. We are turning the physical into the mythical. We are creating stories about a time and a place we cannot visit. We are preserving memory. And in doing so, we are maintaining the connection, the thread that links us to the ancestors, that keeps alive the knowledge that the world was different, that the rivers were there, that the networks existed, that we were connected. And perhaps this is enough. Perhaps the point is not to recreate the past, not to bring back the ancient rivers, not to rebuild the networks exactly as they were. Perhaps the point is to learn from them, to understand that connection is possible, that networks can be built, that cooperation across distances and differences can create systems that benefit all, that allow resources to flow, knowledge to spread, people to move and meet and exchange, and to recognize that these networks are fragile, that they depend on conditions that can change, that maintaining them requires effort, attention, adaptation. The ancient river networks failed because the climate changed and no one could control that. But they also failed, perhaps, because the people did not adapt quickly enough, did not diversify their resources, did not build redundancy into their systems. They were dependent on the rivers. And when the rivers failed, the systems failed. And we, in our time, we are similarly dependent. We are dependent on fossil fuels, on global trade networks, on electronic communication systems, on political and economic structures that are showing signs of stress, of fragility, of potential failure. And we are not adapting quickly enough. We are not building the redundancy. We are not preparing for the changes that are coming. We are assuming the rivers will always flow. But they will not. They are already changing. And we need to remember the lessons of the past. We need to diversify. We need to localize. We need to build resilience. We need to maintain connections even when they are difficult. We need to tell the stories. We need to preserve the memory, because the future will need them. And the stories we tell about the ancient rivers, the narratives we construct about the networks that once existed and then collapsed, these are not just about the past. They are about us. They are showing us ourselves, our own vulnerabilities, our own dependencies, our own fragility. They are warning us, but they are also encouraging us. They are saying, people have faced this before. Civilizations have collapsed before. Networks have failed before. And people survived. They adapted. They learned. They rebuilt. And they remembered. And you can do the same. You have the knowledge. You have the technology. You have the capacity to see patterns, to understand systems, to anticipate changes, to adapt. You have the stories. You have the memory. You have the connection to the past, to the ancestors who traveled the rivers, who built the networks, who faced the collapse and survived. And you have the responsibility to the future, to the generations who will come after, who will need to know that this happened, that we faced it, that we adapted, that we preserved the knowledge, that we maintained the connections even when it was difficult, even when the rivers dried up, even when the networks failed. This is the work. This is the calling. This is what the silver rivers are asking of us. Not to mourn what was lost, but to learn from it, to honor it, to carry it forward, to build new networks, to create new connections, to find new paths, and to tell the stories so that the memory lives, so that the knowledge survives, so that the future, when it looks back, will see that we understood, that we tried, that we cared, that we remembered the rivers, and that we tried to build something worthy of the ancestors who came before us and the descendants who will come after. Something that flows, something that connects, something that endures. In the spaces between words, in the silence that follows the telling of the story, there is something you must feel. It is not data. It is not evidence. It is not the LiDAR scans or the satellite imagery or the carefully measured river channels hidden beneath the soil. It is the weight of absence. It is the presence of what is no longer there. It is standing in a desert and Truly knowing that 10,000 years ago this was a river valley, that water flowed here, that people lived here, that boats moved across the surface carrying goods and stories and songs, and that all of it is gone. The water, the people, the songs, vanished so completely that if not for the technology, if not for the faint depressions in the earth, if not for the myths preserved by those who refused to forget, we would never know it existed. And this knowing, this awareness of the vanished world, it changes something inside you. It makes you see differently. It makes you understand that the ground beneath your feet is not just rock and soil. It is history. It is memory. It is the accumulated record of countless lives, countless journeys, countless moments when people looked at the same sky you see now and wondered about the same questions you wonder about. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And the answer the rivers give, the answer encoded in their vanished channels and their mythological afterlives, is this: you are travelers. You have always been travelers. You are not meant to stay in one place, clinging to one way of life, assuming permanence. You are meant to move, to adapt, to flow like water, finding new paths when the old ones close, seeking new connections when the old networks break. This is what it means to be human. Not to build monuments that last forever, not to create systems that never change, but to move, to adapt, to remember, to carry forward what is essential and to let go of what is not. The river teaches this. The river is always moving, always changing, carving new channels, abandoning old ones, responding to the shape of the land, to the climate, to the forces that act upon it. And the people who lived by the rivers, who organized their lives around the rivers, they understood this. They did not fight the river. They flowed with it. And when the river changed, they changed too. But there is a paradox here. Because to flow, to adapt, to change, you must also remember. You must carry with you the knowledge of where you have been, what you have learned, what has worked and what has not. You must tell the stories. You must preserve the memory. Not as a rigid set of rules, not as dogma, but as a resource, as a reservoir of knowledge that can be drawn upon when needed, that can inform the adaptations, that can guide the changes. The stories about the silver rivers, the myths about the paths of water, the oral traditions that preserve the knowledge of vanished geographies. These are not chains binding people to the past. These are tools. These are technologies. These are ways of carrying knowledge across time, across changes, across the deaths of systems and the births of new ones. And the people who preserved these stories, who kept them alive through centuries and millennia, they were doing essential work. They were maintaining the connection to the past. They were ensuring that the knowledge would survive. They were making it possible for us now to look back and understand, to see the patterns, to learn from what happened, to avoid making the same mistakes, to build on the same successes. And this is why the dismissal of oral traditions, the tendency to privilege written records over spoken memories, the assumption that peoples without writing were peoples without history, this is not just inaccurate. It is dangerous. It cuts us off from vast repositories of knowledge. It silences voices that have been speaking for millennia. It erases histories that are no less real, no less important than the histories written in books. The rivers existed. The networks functioned. The civilizations thrived. And the peoples who remember them, who tell their stories, who insist that their ancestors built the earthworks, traveled the rivers, lived in the cities that the LiDAR is now revealing. They are not making things up. They are not romanticizing the past. They are remembering. And we need to listen. We need to learn. We need to integrate these oral histories into our understanding of the human past. Not uncritically, the stories are, after all, filtered through generations, mixed with myth and symbol, but seriously, with respect, with the recognition that they contain information, that they preserve knowledge, that they are data. And that when we combine them with the archaeological evidence, with the geological reconstructions, with the technological revelations of LiDAR and satellites, we get a more complete picture. We see more clearly. We understand more deeply. And we can learn more effectively. And what we learn ultimately is that we are not alone. We are not the first to face the challenges we face. We are not the first to watch our networks become fragile, to see our resources diminish, to recognize that the systems we depend on are not sustainable, are not permanent. Others have faced this, and they survived by adapting, by cooperating, by maintaining connections even when it was difficult, by preserving knowledge even when it had no immediate practical use, by telling stories even when no one was listening. And now we are listening, and the stories are revealing their secrets. The rivers were there. The networks existed. The people were sophisticated, capable, resilient, and they are still here. Not in the same forms, not in the same places, but here. In the descendants who carry the stories. In the genes that show the migrations. In the myths that preserve the memories. In the earth that holds the traces of their presence. They are here, and they are speaking. And if we listen, if we truly listen, we will hear not just facts about the past but wisdom for the future. Wisdom about adaptation, about resilience, about connection, about memory, about the importance of flowing with the changes rather than resisting them, about the necessity of preserving knowledge across catastrophes, about the value of community, of cooperation, of maintaining networks even when they are expensive, even when they are difficult, even when the benefits are not immediate. Because networks are what save us. Networks are what make us more than isolated individuals struggling alone. Networks are what create civilization, not in the sense of cities and kings and monuments, but in the sense of humans cooperating, humans connecting, humans creating systems that serve the collective, that allow knowledge to flow, resources to be shared, people to move and meet and exchange. This is what the rivers taught. This is what the networks demonstrated. This is what the stories preserve. And this is what we must remember. And so, as we prepare to leave the rivers behind, as the night grows deeper and the boundary between waking and sleeping begins to blur, let us consider one more question. What will the future see when it looks back at us? What will the archaeologists of 1,000 years from now find when they strip away the layers of our time and examine what we left behind? Will they find monuments? Will they find networks? Will they find stories? Or will they find only ruins, fragments, traces of a civilization that did not adapt, that did not preserve, that did not maintain the connections? This is not an idle question. This is urgent, because the choices we make now, the systems we build, the knowledge we preserve, the stories we tell, these will determine what survives, what is remembered, what the future can learn from us. And the lesson of the rivers is clear. Networks matter. Connection matters. Adaptation matters. Memory matters. If we build systems that are rigid, that depend on resources that are finite, that concentrate rather than distribute, that isolate rather than connect, those systems will fail. And when they fail, what will remain? But if we build systems that are flexible, that diversify, that create redundancy, that maintain connections even across distances and differences, those systems have a chance. Not a guarantee. There are no guarantees. The climate will change. The rivers will shift. The unexpected will happen. But flexible systems can adapt. Networked systems can reroute. Systems that preserve knowledge can rebuild. And systems that tell stories can remember. And the stories we tell about the ancient rivers, the narratives we are constructing now about the vanished networks and the lost geographies, these are important. Not just as history, not just as archaeology, but as preparation, as rehearsal, as a way of thinking through what it means to lose a network, to see a system collapse, to watch the rivers dry up. Because we are living through something similar. The rivers of our time, the rivers of communication, of trade, of energy, of information, these are under stress. The networks are becoming fragile. The connections are breaking. And we need to be ready. We need to know that this has happened before. We need to learn from what our ancestors did. We need to understand what worked and what did not. We need to preserve the knowledge. We need to tell the stories. And the story we tell must be honest. It must acknowledge the losses. It must recognize that when networks collapse, people suffer. Communities are displaced. Knowledge is lost. Ways of life that sustained people for generations become impossible. This is not romantic. This is not an adventure. This is tragedy. And the ancient peoples who lived through the drying of the rivers, who watched their world transform from abundance to scarcity, who had to abandon the settlements their ancestors built, who had to leave behind the graves of their dead and travel to unknown lands seeking water, they experienced tragedy. And the grief of that experience is preserved in the stories, in the longing for the silver rivers, in the memory of the paths of water, in the sense that something essential was lost, something that could never be fully recovered. We must honor this grief. We must recognize the cost of adaptation. We must acknowledge that survival is not always triumph. Sometimes survival is simply survival. And that is enough. That is everything. But the story must also be hopeful. It must recognize that people did survive, that they did adapt, that they did preserve the knowledge, that they did maintain connections across the distances, across the barriers, across the generations, that they told the stories, that the stories were true, that we are rediscovering them, that the technology is revealing what was hidden, that the rivers, though vanished, are still speaking, and that this rediscovery changes us, teaches us, prepares us. It gives us perspective. It gives us humility. It gives us resilience. It shows us that we are part of a long story, a story that includes rises and falls, connections and fragmentations, abundances and scarcities. And it shows us that the story continues, that it does not end with collapse, that after the fall comes the rebuilding, that after the forgetting comes the remembering, that the cycle turns, and that we have the choice, the agency, the capacity to influence how the cycle turns. We can choose to preserve knowledge. We can choose to maintain connections. We can choose to adapt rather than resist. We can choose to tell stories that will help the future understand what we faced, what we learned, what we tried to do. And so the final message of the rivers, the deepest teaching they offer, is this: you are not alone. You are not the first. You are not facing unprecedented challenges. Others have walked this path before you, and they left markers. They left traces in the earth. They left stories in the myths. They left knowledge in the oral traditions. And now, with technology, with archaeology, with linguistics and genetics and climatology, we can read these markers. We can see the traces. We can hear the stories. We can access the knowledge. And we can use it. We can learn from it. We can apply it to our own time, our own challenges, our own need to adapt, to preserve, to connect. The rivers are speaking. The networks are teaching. The ancestors are reaching across time, offering guidance, offering hope, offering the assurance that the human spirit is resilient, that we have survived before, that we can survive again, that we can flow like water, finding new paths when the old ones close, that we can adapt like the river, responding to changes rather than resisting them, that we can remember like the stories, carrying forward the essential knowledge even when everything else is lost. This is the inheritance of the rivers. This is the gift of the vanished networks. This is what the silver paths of water are offering us. Not answers, not solutions, but perspective, wisdom, connection, hope. The world was different once. The rivers flowed where now there are deserts. The networks connected what now is isolated. The people moved through geographies that no longer exist. And when the world changed, when the rivers dried up, when the networks collapsed, the people adapted. They moved. They survived. They remembered. And they are still here. In the descendants who carry the genes. In the cultures that preserve the stories. In the earth that holds the traces. In the myths that speak of silver rivers. They are here. And they are saying, you can do this. You can survive the changes. You can adapt to the new world. You can maintain the connections. You can preserve the knowledge. You can tell the stories. You can flow. You can remember. You can thrive. And as sleep takes you, as the rivers of consciousness flow into the ocean of dreams, carry this with you. Carry the image of water moving through ancient channels. Carry the sound of boats on vanished rivers. Carry the feeling of connection across impossible distances. Carry the knowledge that you are part of a network, a vast human network that spans time and space, that connects the ancestors to the descendants, that links the past to the future through the living present. You are a node in this network. You are a carrier of the stories. You are a preserver of the memory. You are a traveler on the rivers, both physical and metaphorical, that flow through human history, human consciousness, human hope. And the rivers are still flowing, not in the same places, not in the same ways, but still flowing. in the stories, in the memory, in the earth, in you, always in you. The rivers are flowing. The networks are connecting. The stories are speaking. And you are listening. And in listening, you are remembering. And in remembering, you are ensuring that the knowledge survives, that the connections hold, that the future, when it comes, will know we were here. We saw the rivers. We understood the networks. We adapted to the changes. We preserved the knowledge. We told the stories. We remembered, and we passed it on. To you, always to you, the rivers, the silver paths, the connections, the memory, the hope, forever flowing, forever connecting, forever here, in the earth, in the stories, in you, always, forever. Now, sleep well, traveler. The rivers are waiting, in the dreams, in the memory, in the deep places where the water still flows, will always flow, connecting us all, carrying us home. And in the deepest hour, when consciousness floats in that liminal space between thought and dream, between knowing and forgetting, there is one more truth that the rivers whisper. It is the simplest truth. It is the most profound truth. It is this: everything is connected. Everything has always been connected. The isolation you feel, the separation you perceive between yourself and the past, between your culture and other cultures, between the human and the natural world, this is illusion. This is the forgetting. The rivers knew. The water knew. Because water connects. Water does not recognize borders. Water does not see divisions. Water flows from mountain to ocean, touching everything along the way, carrying minerals from the rocks, nutrients from the soil, seeds from the plants, stories from the people who live along its banks. Water is the ultimate network, the original connection, the force that shapes landscapes and links ecosystems and makes life possible. And when the ancient peoples organized their civilizations around rivers, when they built their networks along waterways, when they traveled the channels and learned the currents and told stories about the silver paths, they were recognizing something fundamental. They were understanding that connection is not optional. Connection is not a luxury. Connection is essential. Connection is life. And the forgetting of this, the loss of this understanding, this is perhaps the deepest tragedy of the vanished rivers. Not just that the physical waterways dried up, but that with them went the lived experience of connection, the daily immersion in a system that demonstrated constantly and undeniably that everything is part of a larger whole, that what happens upstream affects what happens downstream, that the health of the source affects the health of the mouth, that we are all part of the same flow. The rivers taught this. And when the rivers dried up, the lesson became abstract. It became philosophy rather than experience. It became something you had to be told rather than something you knew in your body, in your daily life, through your direct engagement with the world. And in becoming abstract, it became easier to deny. It became possible to imagine yourself as separate, as independent, as not connected to the land, to the water, to the other peoples and creatures who share the earth. And this denial, this illusion of separation, this is the root of so many of our current crises. Environmental degradation, social fragmentation, the breakdown of trust, the collapse of cooperation. These are all symptoms of the forgetting. These are all consequences of the lost connection. These are what happen when we stop seeing ourselves as part of the river, as nodes in the network, as travelers on shared paths, and start seeing ourselves as isolated individuals, competing for resources, building walls rather than bridges, damming the flow rather than moving with it. But the rediscovery of the ancient rivers, the revelation through technology of the networks that once existed, the confirmation through science of the stories that oral traditions have been telling, this is not just an archaeological curiosity. This is a reminder. This is a calling back. This is the earth saying, remember. Remember who you are. Remember where you come from. Remember that you are connected. Remember that the rivers flowed, that the networks existed, that the ancestors knew, that the knowledge was preserved. Remember that you are part of something larger. Remember that isolation is illusion. Remember that connection is truth. Remember that the rivers, though vanished from the surface, are still there beneath, in the channels carved into bedrock, in the stories carved into memory, in the connections carved into the human heart. Remember, and in remembering, reconnect. rebuild the networks, restore the flows, relearn the lesson that the rivers taught. Everything is connected. Everything has always been connected. And everything always will be. And this is why the stories matter. This is why the myths must be preserved. This is why the oral traditions must be honored. Because they are not just about the past. They are about the future. They are not just preserving information. They are preserving understanding. They are preserving the awareness that connection is essential, that networks create resilience, that isolation creates vulnerability. They are preserving the knowledge of how to live in relationship, how to organize societies around flows rather than around fixed points, how to adapt when conditions change rather than collapsing when systems fail. And this knowledge, this wisdom, this is what the future will need. This is what we need now. This is what the vanished rivers are offering us. Not a map to buried treasure, not a blueprint for ancient technology, but something more precious. A way of seeing, a way of being, a way of understanding our place in the world, our connection to each other, our responsibility to the past and to the future. The rivers are teaching us. Still, always, if we listen, if we remember, if we allow the stories to do what they were designed to do, transform, connect us, carry us forward. And so, as this long journey through the vanished geographies and the preserved memories draws to its close, as the stories about the silver rivers settle into the deep places where all true stories live, know this: you have been changed. Perhaps only slightly, perhaps only in ways you cannot yet name. But you have been touched by the rivers. You have heard the stories. You have seen the evidence. You have contemplated the networks that once connected the world, the peoples who traveled the ancient waterways, the knowledge that was preserved through the forgetting, the memory that survived the collapse. And in contemplating these things, you have become part of the story. You have joined the network. You have taken your place in the long chain of remembering, the human chain that stretches from the ancestors who carved the first boats and learned the first currents to the descendants who will one day, perhaps, rediscover what we are forgetting, who will use technologies we cannot imagine to see patterns we cannot see, who will confirm stories we are telling, who will honor us for preserving the memory, for maintaining the connection, for telling the stories. You are part of this. You are essential to this. The rivers flow through you. The networks connect through you. The stories live in you. And what you do with this, how you carry it forward, how you allow it to change how you see the world and how you act in the world, this matters. This is not abstract. This is not theoretical. This is real. This is now. The rivers of our time are drying up. The networks of our time are becoming fragile. The connections of our time are breaking. And we need to remember. We need to adapt. We need to flow. We need to maintain the connections even when it is difficult. We need to preserve the knowledge even when it seems irrelevant. We need to tell the stories even when no one is listening. Because the future will listen. The future will need the stories. The future will need to know that we faced this, that we understood, that we tried, that we cared. That we remembered the rivers. That we honored the ancestors. That we maintained the connections. That we told the stories. That we passed it on. The rivers are calling. Not the rivers you can see. The rivers beneath. The rivers of memory. The rivers of connection. The rivers of story. The silver rivers. The paths of water. The networks that connect all humans across all time in the great flow of consciousness and memory and hope that is the human story, the human journey, the human attempt to understand the world and our place in it and what we owe to those who came before and to those who will come after. The rivers are calling, and you have answered, by listening, by being here, by allowing the stories to touch you, by remembering, and in remembering, you are ensuring that the rivers, though vanished, are not lost, that the networks, though collapsed, are not forgotten, that the connections, though broken, can be restored, that the knowledge, though hidden, can be recovered, that the stories, though ancient, are still alive, still speaking, still flowing, still connecting, always, forever, here, in you, through you, as you, the river, the network, the connection, the memory, the hope, the story, forever flowing, forever connecting, forever here, always here, in the earth, in the stories, in the hearts of those who remember, in the dreams of those who listen, in the rivers that no longer flow but that still speak, still teach, still guide. The silver rivers, the paths of water, the ancient networks, the vanished geographies, the preserved memories, the living stories, all here, all now, all flowing through you, forever, always, now. Sleep now, traveler. The rivers are carrying you into dreams, into memory, into the deep places where the water still flows, where the connections still hold, where the networks still function, where the ancestors still speak, where the future still listens, where the stories still live. Sleep and dream of rivers, and wake remembering, and carry forward the memory, the connection, the story, the hope, forever flowing, forever here, forever you, the river, the story, the connection, always. There is a final image, a last offering from the rivers, that deserves to rest with you as you drift into sleep. It is the image of a single drop of water, small, insignificant, lost in the vastness of the ocean or the river or the rain cloud from which it falls. And yet, this single drop is part of the whole. It is connected to every other drop, to the river that carries them all, to the ocean that receives them all, to the clouds that will lift them again, to the rain that will bring them back to earth, to the cycle that never ends. The drop does not exist separately. It exists in relationship. It is defined by connection. It is meaningful only as part of the flow. And you are like that drop. You are small in the vastness of human history, of human population, of human time. You are one person, one life, one brief moment in the great river of humanity that has been flowing for hundreds of thousands of years and will flow for who knows how long into the future. And yet, you are part of it. You are connected to every other person, every other life, every other moment. What you do matters. How you live matters. What you remember matters. Because you are part of the flow. You are part of the network. You are part of the story. And the story continues through you. The memory survives in you. The connection is maintained by you. This is not burden. This is gift. This is privilege. This is honor. To be part of something so vast, so ancient, so ongoing. To carry forward the knowledge of the ancestors. To preserve the memory of the vanished rivers. To maintain the connection to those who came before and those who will come after. To tell the stories. To remember. To flow. This is what it means to be human. This is what the rivers teach. This is what the networks demonstrate. This is what the stories preserve. And this is what you, by listening, by being here, by allowing yourself to be touched by these tales of ancient geographies and preserved memories, have chosen to accept. You are part of the story now. You are part of the flow. You are part of the network. And the rivers, though vanished from the surface of the earth, flow through you. The connections, though broken in physical space, are maintained through you. The knowledge, though hidden for millennia, is revealed to you. And the responsibility, though heavy, is shared. Shared with all who remember, all who listen, all who care, all who recognize that we are drops in a river, small but essential, temporary but eternal, individual but utterly, completely, beautifully connected. The rivers remember this. The water has always known this. And now, as the ancient channels are revealed, as the vanished networks are mapped, as the stories are confirmed, we are remembering too. We are recovering the knowledge that isolation is illusion, that connection is truth, that we are all part of the same flow, the same cycle, the same great network of being that includes not just humans but all life, all water, all earth. We are part of this. We have always been part of this. And the forgetting of this, the centuries of assuming we were separate, were special, were not bound by the same laws that govern rivers and forests and ecosystems, this forgetting is ending. The rivers are teaching us again. The networks are showing us again. The stories are reminding us again. We are connected. We are part of the flow. We are drops in the river. And the river is everything. The river is life. The river is connection. The river is memory. The river is hope. The river is the path. The river is home. And as you surrender to sleep, as consciousness dissolves into the undifferentiated ocean of dreams, let yourself be the drop. Let yourself be part of the flow. Let go of the illusion of separation, the fear of isolation, the weight of individual responsibility. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You are part of the river. You are carried by the current. You are connected to the source and the mouth and every point in between. You are part of the ancient network that the technology is revealing, the vanished geography that the stories are preserving, the living connection that the memory is maintaining. You are the river. The river is you. And the river flows, always flows, through change, through loss, through forgetting and remembering, through collapse and rebuilding, through death and rebirth. The river flows, and you, part of the river, flow with it, not fighting, not resisting, simply flowing, simply being, simply belonging to the great current that carries all, connects all, includes all. The river of humanity, the river of consciousness, the river of story, the river of memory, the river of hope, the river of connection, the river that was and is and always will be, the silver river, the path of water, the network of being, the flow of life. Sleep now. The river carries you into the deep places, into the ancient channels, into the vanished geographies, into the preserved memories, into the living stories, into the network that connects all, across time, across space, across the boundaries that seem solid but are not, across the divisions that seem real but are illusion, into the flow, into the connection, into the oneness, into the river, always the river, forever the river that has no beginning and no ending, that simply is, that simply flows, that simply carries all, connects all, includes all. You are part of this. You have always been part of this. You will always be part of this. The river, the network, the connection, the memory, the story, the hope, the flow, forever, always, now, here, in the earth, in the stories, in the dreams, in you, through you, as you, forever, the river, the silver river, the path of water, the connection, the memory, the hope, always flowing, always connecting, always here, always now, always you, forever. And in the morning when you wake, the rivers will still be there, not on the surface, but beneath, in the earth, in the memory, in the stories, in you, and you will carry them forward, into the day, into the world, into the life that continues, carrying the knowledge, preserving the memory, maintaining the connection, telling the stories, being the drop that is part of the river, being the river that flows through time, being the connection that holds, being the memory that survives, being the story that lives, being the hope that endures, being human, being connected, being part of the flow, forever, always, now. The rivers are here. The rivers have always been here. The rivers will always be here. In the earth, in the stories, in the memory, in you, always in you. The river, the network, the connection, the hope, forever flowing, forever connecting, forever here, forever now, forever. Remember, when dawn comes, as it always does, the rivers will still be invisible. The technology will still be needed to see them. The stories will still be required to understand them. The memory will still be fragile, needing preservation, needing telling, needing you. And you will wake into a world that looks the same as it did yesterday. The same geography, the same rivers flowing in their familiar channels, the same deserts and forests and mountains. Nothing will have changed on the surface. But beneath, everything has changed. Because now you know. You know that the earth holds secrets. You know that the geography was different once. You know that the rivers flowed where now there is only sand or forest or empty valleys. You know that people traveled these vanished rivers, built societies along their banks, created networks that connected distant regions, preserved knowledge in stories that survived the collapse of the networks themselves. You know that the maps are incomplete, that the histories are partial, that the official narratives miss vast stretches of human experience, human organization, human achievement. You know that the past is more complex, more interconnected, more sophisticated than the simplified timelines suggest. And knowing this changes you, subtly, profoundly, permanently, because you can no longer look at a desert and see only emptiness. You will wonder, what flowed here once? Who lived here? What stories do the local peoples tell about this place? You can no longer look at a river and see only the present. You will see the past. The people who traveled this water, who depended on it, who built their lives around it. And you will see the future. The changes coming, the possibility that this river too might shift or diminish, that the people who depend on it might face the same choices the ancient peoples faced. You can no longer see isolation. You will see connection. You will see networks. You will see flows of water, of people, of knowledge, of story. You will see the earth not as a collection of separate places but as an interconnected system, dynamic, changing, alive. And you will see humanity not as a progression from primitive to advanced, not as a ladder with you at the top, but as a long, complex journey through time, through landscapes that changed, through systems that rose and fell, through forgettings and rememberings, through losses and rediscoveries. And you will see yourself as part of that journey, not separate from it, not above it, part of it, a traveler on the rivers, a node in the network, a carrier of the stories, a preserver of the memory, a drop in the flow, connected, always connected. And this awareness, this knowing, it will affect how you live. Not necessarily in dramatic ways. You will not abandon your life and become an archaeologist or a river conservationist or a storyteller, unless you choose to. But in small ways, in subtle ways, in the ways you think about the world and your place in it, in the ways you relate to others and to the earth, in the choices you make about what matters and what you want to preserve and what you want to pass on, in these ways you will be different. You will carry the rivers with you, the vanished rivers, the silver rivers, the paths of water, the ancient networks, the preserved memories, the living stories. You will carry them, and in carrying them you will be part of the network. You will be maintaining the connection. You will be preserving the knowledge. You will be telling the stories, not in words necessarily, but in how you live, in what you value, in what you remember, in what you pass on. And this is enough. This is everything. This is what the rivers ask. Not that you do something grand or heroic. Not that you change the world single-handedly, but that you remember, that you recognize the connection, that you honor the ancestors who traveled the rivers and the descendants who will face their own rivers drying up or changing course. That you be the drop that knows it is part of the river. That you be the node that maintains the network. That you be the story that lives. This is enough. This is the work. This is the calling. And it is yours. It has always been yours. From the moment you began listening to this story, from the moment you allowed yourself to wonder about the vanished rivers and the ancient networks, from the moment you recognized that the myths might be true and the stories might be accurate and the forgetting might be temporary and the remembering might be possible, from that moment you became part of the network. You became a carrier of the rivers. You became a preserver of the memory. You became a teller of the stories. And the rivers, flowing through you, will continue. The network connecting through you will hold. The memory living in you will survive. The story told by you will endure. This is the promise. This is the hope. This is the gift of the rivers. Not that they will return. Not that the ancient networks will be rebuilt exactly as they were. But that the knowledge will survive. That the connection will be maintained. That the memory will be preserved. That the stories will be told. That we, in our time, with our challenges, with our networks becoming fragile and our rivers drying up and our systems showing stress, that we will remember. We will remember that this has happened before. We will remember that people survived. We will remember that adaptation is possible. We will remember that networks create resilience. We will remember that isolation is illusion. We will remember that connection is truth. We will remember that we are part of something larger. We will remember the rivers. And in remembering, we will find the strength, the wisdom, the hope to face what comes next, to adapt, to flow, to connect, to survive, to thrive, to carry forward, to pass on, to tell the stories, to preserve the memory, to honor the ancestors, to prepare for the descendants, to be the river, always the river, forever the river, The river that flows through time, through change, through everything. The river that is life. The river that is connection. The river that is memory. The river that is story. The river that is hope. The river that is us. The river that is you. Forever flowing. Forever connecting. Forever here. Forever now. Forever. The civilization that traveled rivers we did not know existed. They were us. They were our ancestors. They were the ones who came before. And they are still here. In the earth. In the stories. In the memory. In you. Always in you. The rivers are in you. The networks are in you. The connections are in you. The knowledge is in you. The hope is in you. Forever. Always. Now. Here. You are the river. You are the network. You are the connection. You are the memory. You are the story. You are the hope. You are the one who remembers. You are the one who tells. You are the one who carries forward. You are the one who flows. Always. Forever. Now. Remember the rivers. Remember the silver paths. Remember the networks. Remember the connections. Remember the ancestors. Remember the stories. Remember who you are. Remember where you come from. Remember that you are not alone. Remember that you are part of the flow. Remember that the river carries you. Remember, always remember, the rivers, the connections, the memory, the hope, forever. Now, in the final silence, before the last word is spoken and the journey ends, there is a question that must be asked. It is the question that has been waiting all along, the question beneath all the other questions, the question that the rivers themselves, in their patient flowing and their sudden vanishing, have always been asking. What do you love? Not what do you know, not what do you understand, not what do you believe, but what do you love? Because love is what preserves. Love is what carries forward. Love is what survives the collapses and the forgettings and the long dark periods when everything seems lost. The people who preserved the stories about the vanished rivers, who kept them alive through centuries when the stories seemed useless, when no one believed them, when there was no practical reason to remember, they did it out of love. Love of the ancestors. Love of the land. Love of the truth. Love of the connection. They loved the rivers even when the rivers were gone. They loved the stories even when the stories seemed like myths. They loved the memory even when the memory was all that remained. And that love, that fierce, enduring, irrational love, that is what saved the knowledge. That is what maintained the connection. That is what makes possible, now, the rediscovery, the confirmation, the recognition that the stories were true. So what do you love? What will you preserve? What will you carry forward through the changes that are coming, through the disruptions and the losses and the necessary adaptations? What matters enough to you that you will hold on to it, protect it, pass it on, even when it seems impractical, even when no one else cares, even when the systems that support it have collapsed and the networks that sustained it have broken? This is not a hypothetical question. This is the question of our time, because we are entering a period of change comparable to the changes that dried up the ancient rivers. The climate is shifting. The systems are becoming unstable. The networks are showing their fragility. And we will lose things. We will have to let go of ways of life that we value, structures that we depend on, assumptions that have felt permanent. This is coming. This is already here. And the question is, what will we save? What will we preserve? What will we love enough to carry through the transition, to pass on to the future, to ensure survives? The rivers, in their flowing and their vanishing, suggest an answer. Preserve connection. Preserve the knowledge of how things relate, how systems interact, how the upstream affects the downstream, how the local connects to the global. Preserve the understanding that we are not separate, not isolated, not independent. Preserve the wisdom that networks create resilience, that diversity strengthens rather than weakens, that cooperation produces better outcomes than competition. Preserve the stories that remind us of times when things were different, when other ways were possible, when people faced challenges and adapted and survived and thrived. Preserve the memory of the silver rivers not as nostalgia for a lost past, but as evidence that the world changes and that we can change with it, that the geography is not fixed and that our ways of living in it are not fixed either, that what seems permanent can vanish and that what seems lost can sometimes be recovered. Preserve hope. Preserve the belief that the story continues, that the cycle turns, that after the fall comes the rise, that after the forgetting comes the remembering, that the rivers, though vanished, are still there beneath, still speaking, still teaching, still offering their wisdom to those who will listen. And preserve love. Preserve the capacity to care about things beyond yourself, beyond your immediate needs, beyond the visible and the practical. Preserve the ability to love the earth, to love the waters, to love the other creatures, to love the other people, to love the ancestors and the descendants, to love the stories and the memories and the connections that make us human. Because love is what will get us through. Love is what will allow us to make the sacrifices that adaptation requires. Love is what will motivate us to preserve knowledge that has no immediate use. Love is what will sustain us through the losses. Love is what will maintain the connections even when maintaining them is difficult. Love is what will carry the stories. Love is what will keep the memory alive. Love is the river that never dries up, that flows even through the driest times, that connects even across the greatest distances, that persists even when everything else fails. Love is the silver river. Love is the path of water. Love is the network that holds. Love is the memory that survives. Love is the story that endures. Love is the hope that remains. Always, forever, now. And so, as this long journey through the vanished geographies and the living memories comes to its close, as the rivers fade back into the earth and the stories fade back into the silence from which they emerged, as the network of words and images and ideas that has connected you to the ancient peoples dissolves and you return to the ordinary world of the present, carry this with you. Carry the rivers. Carry the stories. Carry the connections. Carry the memory. Carry the hope. Carry the love. Because you are the river now. You are the network. You are the connection. You are the memory. You are the story. You are the hope. You are the love. And the flowing is yours. The maintaining is yours. The preserving is yours. The telling is yours. The passing on is yours. This is not burden. This is gift. This is honor. This is privilege. This is love. The rivers are here. They have always been here. They will always be here. Not on the surface, but beneath, in the earth, in the stories, in the memory, in you, always in you. The rivers are in you. The networks are in you. The connections are in you. The ancestors are in you. The descendants are in you. The past is in you. The future is in you. The love is in you. Everything is in you. You are the river. You are the drop and the flow. You are the connection and the network. You are the memory and the forgetting and the remembering. You are the story. You are the love. You are everything. You are part of everything. You are connected to everything. Always, forever, now. And as sleep finally, fully takes you, as the last conscious thought dissolves into the formless awareness of dreams, know this: the rivers are flowing. In you, through you, as you. The rivers are flowing. The networks are holding. The connections are strong. The memory is preserved. The stories are told. The love endures. Everything continues. Everything connects. Everything flows. Forever. Always. Now. Here. In the earth. In the waters. In the air. In the stories. In the silence. In the speaking. In the sleeping. In the waking. In you. Always in you. Forever in you. The rivers. The silver paths. The ancient networks. The vanished geographies. The living memories. The told stories. The preserved knowledge. The maintained connections. The enduring hope. The eternal love. All here. All now. All you. Forever. Always. Sleep. Dream of rivers. Wake remembering. Live loving. Flow connecting. Be the river. Always the river. Forever the river. The river that never ends. The river that never dries. The river that flows through everything. Connects everything. Includes everything. Loves everything. The river that is life. The river that is you. Forever. Now.